Chapter 710. Li Daochong stored the Demon King pill into his storage ring and glanced at the extreme demon sky's dust that had dissipated into the air. He grabbed the unconscious demon spirit with one hand and disappeared in a flash. He had killed a Demon King and released all the lightning tribulation that he had accumulated. Li Daochong, who had been making losses ever since he came to Blackwood Star, had finally recovered some lost ground. In this way, he hadn't lost anything. Li Daochong, who had stepped into the Void Refinement Realm, used the 1,000-sound escape technique and moved as fast as lightning. The white clouds that had gathered above the wasteland looked like a flash of blue lightning. When the primitive tribes of the wasteland saw this flash of lightning, they all knelt down, thinking that an immortal had appeared and chased away the death chi. As for the underworld creatures and ghost beasts, they were unlucky. Although the spiritual chi couldn't directly kill them, it could weaken them until they dissipated. At the edge of the endless abyss in a mine, Hu Ling had assisted Xie Baoshan to move the entrance to the Ghost Palace here. This was the only exit out of Blackwood Star, but even with the door in front of her, Hu Ling couldn't do anything. Besides Li Daochong, no one could open the sealed space crack. Li Daochong challenging the two Demon Kings alone was no different from courting death in Hu Linger's eyes. She naturally didn't want Li Daochong to do so. However, since Li Daochong insisted, Hu Linger couldn't do anything. She could only be anxious, but her heart was filled with despair. After the Ghost Palace moved to the mine, Hu Linger stood at the edge of the mine and looked in the direction of the wasteland, anxiously waiting. This kind of hopeless waiting was a kind of torture. A dazzling brilliance appeared in the sky, and the ground trembled. It seemed that the entire Blackwood Star was shaking. Not only Hu Ling but the remaining tens of thousands of Spirit Sea Realm cultivators all ran out of the Ghost Palace. Everyone anxiously felt the collision between the three terrifying auras in the distance. Soon, a powerful aura disappeared. At first, everyone thought that Li Daochong had fallen and that this result was already predetermined. But after a few breaths, everyone found that something was wrong. The battle was still going on and was even more intense than before. The powerful aura that disappeared just now was the aura of death, not spiritual aura. In other words, Li Daochong did not die, but an extraterrestrial demon was killed. The despairing Hu Ling was completely stupefied. Li Daochong was fighting one against two, yet he could still kill one. How'd he do it? A big question mark appeared in everyone's mind. Then, the surroundings shook as if there was an earthquake, and the brilliance in the horizon was dazzling. The gray clouds of death in the sky continued to dissipate. Li Daochong's aura grew stronger and stronger, constantly clashing with the powerful death chi that still existed. After a while, the other powerful death chi also dissipated. Everyone naturally hoped that Li Daochong would fight the extraterrestrial demons, because this was their only hope of survival. However, everyone believed that Li Daochong had no chance of winning. This was an extremely strange and contradictory feeling. Cultivators with high cultivation levels could even sense a super thunderstorm that could destroy the world. In fact, the location of the battle was very far away from them, but because the aura emitted by Li Daochong and Mo Jitian had already surpassed the limit of a planet, these Spirit Sea Realm cultivators could still sense it. In addition to the intense and terrifying battle, the cultivators also felt the changes in the surrounding environment. The aura of death was quickly disappearing, and the spiritual aura was becoming denser. The cultivators had never dreamed of such a change. Fairy Julie finally could not help but walk to Hu Linger's side and ask, "Exalted Immortal Hu, Exalted Immortal Li, what is his background?" Hu Linger's face was blank, and she thought, "You asked me, but who am I supposed to ask?" When the terrifying thunderclouds in the sky dissipated, a blue brilliance flashed and landed in front of everyone in the blink of an eye. The blue brilliance was naturally Li Daochong, who had returned. After landing, Li Daochong glanced at everyone. He had already deliberately restrained his aura. However, the pressure of an upper-level cultivator still made the tens of thousands of Spirit Sea Realm cultivators unable to breathe. Everyone had the urge to kneel down and submit. No one dared to have the slightest doubt or disrespect towards Li Daochong. He had single-handedly faced 2 extraterrestrial demons. Not only had he killed them, but he had also come out unscathed. The existence of such a cultivator was far beyond the knowledge of the Blackwood Star Spirit Sea Realm cultivators. Li Daochong threw the demon spirit to Hu Ling, and said, "He is injured. Take him to the revered twin dragons to heal." Hu Ling habitually lifted her eyes to look at Li Daochong, but she just couldn't do it. The spiritual pressure naturally emitted from Li Daochong's body made Hu Ling, most proud charm technique, completely ineffective. Hu Ling obediently helped the demon spirit back to the ghost mansion, while Li Daochong soared into the sky. When Hu Ling saw Li Daochong leave as soon as he came, her heart skipped a beat, and she hurriedly asked, "Li Daoyu, where are you going?" "Mending the heavens." Li Daochong only replied with these 2 words before disappearing. "Mending the heavens?" Hu Ling was dumbfounded. Li Daochong naturally did not need to explain anything to Hu Ling. In the blink of an eye, he arrived at Blackwood Star Sky Beyond. This was the area where Li Daochong had sent a wisp of his divine soul not long ago. The twin demons were also here, trying to remove the gelatinous seal around Blackwood Star. Because of Li Daochong's appearance, the twin demons did not succeed. However, they still managed to open a gap in the seal. Li Daochong's wisp of divine soul had not completely disappeared, so he could sense the gap in the seal. Li Daochong glanced at the gap. With a flash of his divine sense, he quickly calculated its size and returned to the seal. Then, lightning shot out from his eyes, and the lightning net quickly sealed the gap. Li Daochong naturally could not use the Immortal's method to seal the gap. He could only use his own method. The lightning net seal might not be comparable to the Immortal's seal, but it could temporarily close the gap and achieve the effect of the seal. After Li Daochong finished everything, he immediately returned to the mine. He shot into the endless abyss and arrived at the location of the spatial crack. Not long ago, Li Daochong had just removed the demonic qi from the spatial crack. Half of it had not been dealt with. At this time, when Li Daochong probed with his divine sense again, his pupils shrank, his brows furrowed, and he let out a surprised gasp. Not only had the demonic qi been completely restored, but it was even stronger than before. The strength of this demonic qi was even stronger than the 2 demon kings Li Daochong had killed. Li Daochong felt that something was wrong. He immediately focused his divine sense and quickly probed the seal. A few seconds later, Li Daochong came into contact with a strange, faintly discernible demonic thought. Out of curiosity, Li Daochong immediately disguised it with a wisp of his divine sense and probed the demonic intent. In an instant, the scene before Li Daochong changed. He appeared in a world shrouded in darkness. He seemed to be standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the starry, dark red city below with his hands behind his back. Li Daochong could vaguely see his own appearance from the floor-to-ceiling window. Li Daochong was shocked. How was this still his face? His face was as sharp as a knife, his eyebrows sharp and his lips thin. His face was pale, but there was no color of death. Instead, he had a devilishly handsome face. He was over 2 meters tall and wore a black cardigan, revealing the sculpted lines of his muscles. He was robust, but not bloated. Li Daochong naturally understood that this was not his appearance. He seemed to have entered someone else's consciousness and could see everything through their eyes. Wasn't this soul possession? Li Daochong was a little confused. He was just probing the demonic qi from the spatial crack. How did he enter someone else's consciousness? Your Highness, Mo Ji Tian and Zhou Luoyin's underworld tablets have shattered. At this time, an elder's voice came from behind him. The devilishly handsome face reflected in the floor-to-ceiling window flashed a cold smile. Then he turned around. A black-bearded, black-haired, square-faced, ferocious-looking elder stood there with his head lowered respectfully. I already know. A magnetic voice with a strong sense of emptiness came from Li Daochong's perception. How did your Highness know? The elder looked at the man Li Daochong in confusion and asked. Li Daochong was very surprised to be addressed as Your Highness. He had unintentionally possessed someone else's body, and it turned out to be a Your Highness. Haha. The man who was addressed as Your Highness heard the elder's question and suddenly looked up and laughed. The elder's expression was uncertain. He did not know why Your Highness was laughing. Your Highness pointed at his own head and said, Li Daochong is here right now. The elder's turbid eyes suddenly widened, and an expression of disbelief appeared on his face. Li Daochong, who was taking advantage of the situation to peek, heard this, and his soul moved slightly. He did not expect the other party to know. Li Daochong, we've fought so many times, and we finally meet today. You made me feel that surging passion when I invaded the human race all those years ago. As thanks, I'll let you take a stroll in my consciousness. I wonder what Mr. Li thinks. The man said playfully. Li Daochong, who was far away on the Black Tree planet, felt his heart skip a beat. The other party had deliberately let him sneak in. Li Daochong vaguely guessed the man's identity. You're Sakyamapa, Prince of Jiuyo. Mr. Li's foresight is godly. That's right, it's me. Mobile version of the website. Chapter 711. Although Li Daochong had guessed it, his body still trembled when he heard the man admit it. Starting from 13 Spectre, everything that Li Daochong encountered had the prince's shadow behind it. Li Daochong tried to sense Sakyamapa's level, but to no avail. Other than being able to sense the outside world through Sakyamapa's sight and hearing, he could not sense anything else. Mr. Li, your bone age is not high, but you're quite capable. Your combat power is rare in this world. Ben Huang sees that you're a talent and admires you. If you submit to Ben Huang and work for the Hades, Ben Huang will not pursue your past and will even give you great benefits, allowing you to unleash your potential to the extreme. When the time comes, the immortal realm will be yours. What do you think? Sakyamapa continued. Li Daochong was confused. Even if he wanted to win someone over, you should have some skills. Did he think that he was a 3-year-old child? He had just killed 2 of his capable subordinates, and this was all he could do? Li Daochong muttered in his heart, but the soul in Sakyamapa's mind spoke. Li is honored to receive the prince's favor, but Li still feels comfortable being a human. I'm not used to being a ghost or a dog. Mr. Li, you don't have to reject so quickly. Ben Huang is absolutely sincere. He's not playing any tricks. Sakyamapa was full of sincerity. Was there something wrong with this prince's brain? Li Daochong's main body on Black Jupiter curled his lips and said, People who walk different paths cannot work together. There's no need to say more. Sakyamapa smiled. All right, Ben Huang, let's take a step back. Mr. Li doesn't have to submit to the Hades and form an alliance with Ben Huang. As long as Mr. Li agrees, Ben Huang will immediately give you 3 immortal-level cultivation methods, 5 immortal-level magic treasures, 500,000 high-grade spirit stones, and various 3-star and above spirit pills. What do you think? Li Daochong's face revealed a look of surprise. This was a huge investment. Why was this Prince of Hades trying to win him over? Li Daochong really wanted to know the reason. Alliance? Mr. Li is just an itinerant cultivator. He hasn't even been to the 3 major cultivation empires. He's neither a descendant of a super family nor a senior executive of a super cultivation company in the human realm. Mr. Li really doesn't understand. Why would the heir of Jiuyo ally with Mr. Li? Haha, Mr. Li, you don't have to be so modest. With the talent you've shown, Ben Huang has lived for tens of thousands of years. He's fought everywhere and slaughtered thousands of races in the spiritual realm, but he's never met a cultivator with such combat strength at such a young age like you. Mr. Li, you humans have a good saying, a fish with a golden carp is not a fish in a pond. It won't be long before Mr. Li's name will be known throughout the human realm. Compared to Mr. Li, those little bastards from the 3 major cultivation empires are just a bunch of clowns, Sakyamapa said with a smile. However, after hearing what he said, Li Daochong was even more dumbfounded. He didn't even know that he would become famous. How the hell did you know? Besides, Li Daochong didn't like to be high profile, nor did he like to be famous. Making a fortune in silence was the way of the king. Mr. Li, You'd rather be quiet than be famous all over the world. Haha, Mr. Li, Ben Huang said that you're not a fish in a pond. You may enjoy yourself in the deep waters, but it's not your world after all. We're off topic. Let's not talk about these useless things. If your highness still wants to play dumb with Mr. Li, then we don't have to talk anymore. Li Daochong was a little impatient. He had just said a lot, but there was no valuable information at all. Mr. Li is a straightforward person. Then, Ben Huang won't keep you in suspense. Mr. Li, do you know why the Hades attacked the human realm years ago, but were defeated? Spirit nuclear bombs, spirit bullets, spirit electromagnetic cannons, super spirit talismans, any one of them is enough to make you suffer. Mr. Li is right. These super powerful offensive weapons created by human cultivation technology are indeed powerful. Even a great Demon King level Hades could be killed in an instant, but at the Supreme Devil level, there's still a way to escape from these weapons, not to mention the Devil Emperor. The highest level of human cultivation is the Mahayana level, which corresponds to the Supreme Devil of the Hades. However, the Supreme Devil is not the highest level in the Hades. There's still the Devil Emperor above them. You might as well tell Mr. Li that the Devil Emperor is not the highest level in the Hades. Sakyamapa explained calmly. Hiss! Li Daochong couldn't help but gasp. In many historical books, the highest level of the Hades that he knew of was the Supreme Devil. He had seen the Devil Emperor in some unofficial history books. However, unofficial history books couldn't be taken into account. They were all just imagination. He didn't expect the Devil Emperor to really exist. And not the highest level? Oh, is that so? Then what's the highest level? Li Daochong asked calmly. Even Ben Huang doesn't know the highest level. He only knows that there's a devil god above the Devil Emperor. Sakyamapa didn't hide anything. Your Highness, are you saying that the human spirit nuclear bombs are useless against the Devil Emperor? Li Daochong continued asking. You could say that the Devil Emperor is no longer a cultivator like you cultivators talk about, but an immortal. Li Daochong remained silent and waited for Sakyamapa to continue. Ben Huang admits that the human race is the toughest bone to chew since the Hades invaded the spirit realm. Because of a miscalculation, the Hades suffered heavy losses back then. However, it wasn't enough to hurt them. After they came back to their senses, it was still easy for them to wipe out the human race. Just as the Hades were about to launch a bigger attack, a fire broke out in their backyard. They were ambushed, and the 4 Devil Emperors were almost all killed. That was why the Hades ordered the evacuation of the human realm, resulting in a standoff between the two sides. The more Li Daochong listened, the more he felt that something was amiss. The history of the descent of the Hades could be learned from elementary school all the way to university. However, what the history said was completely different from what Sakyamapa was saying. The history of the human race recorded that the human race drove the Hades out of the human realm with their intelligence, advanced cultivation techniques, and blood-soaked cultivators. However, as the instigator, he had given a completely different history and reason. For some reason, Li Daochong trusted Sakyamapa more. It wasn't that the history of the human race was fake, but it was very likely that it was incomplete. The human race had no idea what happened to the Hades back then. After all, the Hades were the invaders, and the human race was only invaded. No one went deep into the Hades, so no one knew what happened there. According to Sakyamapa, the Devil Emperors were even more powerful than Mahayana cultivators. They were equivalent to the immortals in the human race's legends. The 4 Devil Emperors were attacked at the same time, and were almost wiped out. What kind of existence attacked the Hades back then? Li Daochong vaguely guessed something. The one who attacked the Hades back then was an immortal? Li Daochong asked. That's right. It was the immortal that you human cultivators talk about for generations, Sakyamapa replied. Even an immortal couldn't stand it. If you want to blame someone, you can only blame the Hades for going too far. Naturally, you'll be punished by the heavens, Li Daochong said coldly. Mr. Li, you're wrong. The Hades were forced to do this from the first day they invaded the spirit realm. Chapter 712. Li Daochong remained silent, waiting for Sakyamapa to continue. After a moment of silence, the prince continued. Someone wants to establish a new order in the Hades, and the Hades don't want to be enslaved. There was a lot of information in this sentence, and Li Daochong had his own guesses. The Hades were vast, and the underworld demons were terrifyingly powerful. If someone wanted to annex the Hades, what kind of existence would this person be? Clearly, this person was not an individual and had to be from the immortal world. However, in the spirit realm, the immortal world was just a legend, and there was no conclusive evidence to prove whether the immortal world really existed. There were only a few very old books that recorded the ascension of Mahayana cultivators. However, too much time had passed, and there was no way to prove their authenticity. Mr. Li, the Hades invaded the spirit realm to protect themselves. From another perspective, the Hades saved the spirit realm, and if the Hades did not invade the spirit realm back then, the spirit realm would have died even more miserably. Sakyamapa's words were shocking. However, Li Daochong did not want to delve any further into this. He could only believe half of Sakyamapa's words, and the other half could not be trusted. The underworld demons were the underworld demons after all, and no matter what reason the Hades had invaded the spirit realm, they were still the spirit realm's enemy. A strong person beat you up, and you killed another weak person in order to protect yourself. This logic did not hold water. Sakyamapa's words were getting more and more ridiculous, and even if what he said was true, Li Daochong did not want to listen anymore. Your Highness, you're still going off topic. Whether it's the Hades, the spirit realm, or the existence that wants to annex the Hades, it's all too big for a small cultivator like Li. Moreover, Li is not interested in history, and people should live in the present. Your Highness, if you don't get to the point, Li will take his leave. With that, Li Daochong was about to cut off his spiritual sense. Wait a minute. Sakyamapa stopped him and continued. Mr. Li, Hades has been holding back all these years not because he's afraid of you humans, but because the immortals interfered and kidnapped 3 of Hades' demon emperors. One of them is the king of Jiuming Nation, Jiuming Spirit Emperor. Li Daochong, who no longer had the desire to continue the conversation, became slightly interested after hearing this. In order to contain Hades, the immortals imprisoned 3 demon emperors in the human realm. No one knows exactly where they are. As long as Hades invades the human realm, the 2 demon emperors will be torn apart by the immortal power. All these years, Hades has been searching for the whereabouts of the 3 demon emperors. If he can't save the demon emperors, Hades won't dare to attack the human realm. At this point, Sakyamapa stopped. Li Daochong continued. Since you were worried about the 3 demon emperors, why did Hades keep stirring up trouble and launching invasions all these years? At least Mr. Li doesn't seem to have any scruples. That's because Hades also imprisoned 2 immortals. Li Daochong's body suddenly shook. This news was explosive enough. Immortals really existed. So, the human realm's spirit realm is a chess piece in the game between the immortal realm and Hades? Sakyamapa didn't say anything. It seemed like he acquiesced, but it also seemed like he didn't. Li Daochong continued. Since you have chips in your hands, why don't you make an exchange? Because the immortal realm no longer exists. How can we make an exchange? What the F***CK? Li Daochong exclaimed inwardly. He would never have guessed that Shura Kasayapa's answer would be this, no matter how hard he thought about it. The immortal realm no longer existed. Why didn't it exist? If the immortal realm didn't exist, Li Daochong could still understand. But if the immortal realm existed, how could it be destroyed? If even the immortal realm could be destroyed, then wouldn't there be nothing left in this world? What do you mean the immortal realm no longer exists? Mr. Li, don't you understand? The only ones who could destroy the immortal realm are themselves. Tens of thousands of years ago, a great war broke out in the immortal realm. The 2 groups of immortals clashed over resources, and the conflict eventually spread to the entire immortal realm. This is also the reason why the immortal realm later annexed Hades and established order. But the exact reason is unknown now. Ben Huang only knows that there are only 2 immortals left. They are both imprisoned in the infernal prison. The immortal realm has collapsed and disappeared. Li Daochong's expression was uncertain. Sakyamapa's words were getting more and more explosive. Even Li Daochong felt that his imagination wasn't enough. Your Highness, why don't you just tell me why you want to form an alliance with Li? What does Li do to deserve this? Sakyamapa picked up a goblet full of blood-red liquid from the table. At first glance, the liquid inside seemed to be blood, but upon closer inspection, it wasn't as viscous as blood. This was the strongest wine in the Hades Bloodfire wine. Sakyamapa took a big gulp and gently swirled the goblet. He watched the blood-red liquid sway in the goblet before speaking. The path of immortality opens once every 100 years. In the past 1,000 years, it's only opened 10 times. However, this path of immortality is blessed with an extremely powerful seal. Only those below the body integration stage or Demon King level can enter. Those above that level of cultivation can't enter even if they have extraordinary abilities. With Mr. Li's current strength, I'm afraid that he's invincible under the body integration stage. Therefore, Ben Huang wants to form an alliance with Mr. Li. I hope that you can find someone in the path of immortality and bring that person out. As long as you can accomplish this, I, Ben Huang, will be at your disposal in the future. Ah, Li Daochong suddenly burst into laughter. Why are you laughing, sir? Sakyamapa didn't understand. Your Highness, what right does Li have to help the Hades find someone? Li Daochong's expression changed. Sakyamapa's expression darkened slightly. Sir, Ben Huang has already expressed enough sincerity. As long as you agree, the item Ben Huang previously promised you will immediately appear on the Black Tree Star. Once the matter is settled, I, Ben Huang, will present the Immortal's inheritance to you with both hands. Li Daochong originally wanted to refuse or cut off his divine will. At this point, he already knew what he should and shouldn't know. As for what Sakyamapa had up his sleeve, Li Daochong had no interest in knowing. However, Li Daochong suddenly thought of something and said, The Immortal's inheritance? Your Highness, do you think the Hades have imprisoned 2 immortals just because you said so? How will you know if it's true or not? Li? The allure of the Immortal's inheritance was something that even Li Daochong would be tempted by. After all, it was an immortal, a truly immortal existence. Who wouldn't want to become an immortal? Although Li Daochong had the hot-blooded upgrade tool, it was hard to say whether this thing would allow him to attain an immortal body in the end. Sakyamapa's expression relaxed, as if he had already expected Li Daochong to ask this question. He muttered a few words and tossed out a piece of black jade. A black spatial door opened. If you don't believe me, sir, then follow Ben Huang. With that, Sakyamapa stepped into the black hole. The moment he stepped in, Li Daochong's divine will was separated and transformed into a phantom. Sakyamapa's true body also entered the black hole, only a wisp of his demonic soul. The scene on the other side of the black hole completely stunned Li Daochong. This was a vast and boundless space of darkness. 2 enormous black mountains floated in the void. These 2 enormous black mountains were even bigger than a cultivation planet. At the foot of the mountains were 2 giants bound by countless chains burning with black flames. Although they were giants, they were still pathetically small when compared to the 2 mountains. However, Li Daochong estimated that the 2 of them were more than 1,000 feet tall and should be immortal bodies. The aura emitted from the 2 of them was extremely terrifying, even in this dark space filled with dense netherworld aura. Their immortal power was still overbearing. Compared to the immortal chi Li Daochong had sensed in the Jade Divine Peak's cave abode, it was many times stronger. This was the true immortal chi. The spirit chi was more than 50% rich. On the surface, it looked like the 2 immortals were imprisoned, but in fact they were not completely bound. They were constantly competing with the 2 enormous black mountains. Mr. Li, Ben Huang would not lie to you about this kind of thing. If you can take a peek at the inheritance of these 2 immortals, it would be easy for you to surpass the Mahayana realm. Li Daochong kept confirming whether everything in front of him was real or not. He even split a wisp of his divine soul and directly entered the enormous black mountains. He was sure that this was not a fantasy. Everything could be faked. The 2 immortal chi and the majestic immortal power could not be faked. Even if a fiend celestial descended, he would not be able to create such realistic immortal power. This was because immortal power and demonic chi were completely opposite source powers. Chapter 7:13. After exiting the Hades, Li Daochong had mixed feelings. There was too much information in his conversation with Sakyamappa. It was hard to tell how much was true and how much was false. However, there was one thing that Li Daochong was sure of. Sakyamappa really wanted to work with him. However, the promise that he would do whatever he wanted after that was bullsh*t. Even if Sakyamappa swore, Li Daochong would not believe this kind of nonsense. There was no proof. It could only be a bunch of nonsense. However, the fact that the Hades could imprison immortals meant that the Hades was strong enough to fight against the immortal realm. This was not good news. The Hades might be much more powerful than what the human realm knew. Li Daochong had been in contact with Sakyamappa. It was not because he was tempted, but because he wanted to get more information. Li Daochong did not take Sakyamappa's promise seriously at all. Besides, no matter how many cultivation resources were given, they were useless to Li Daochong. Li Daochong's cultivation resources were the entire Hades. "Mr. Li, can you believe Ben Wang's words now?" Sakyamappa said as soon as he came out. "How can Li not believe His Highness? There is one thing that Li does not understand. What is the path of immortality?" Li Daochong asked unhurriedly. The path of immortality is a fragment world left behind after the collapse of the immortal realm. It is said that the secret to rebuilding the immortal realm is hidden inside. 1,000 years ago, an envoy from the Hades investigated the portal of the path of immortality and analyzed that there might be immortals on the path of immortality. He tried to get in touch with them and negotiate a hostage exchange. However, 1,000 years have passed, and there is still no trace of the immortals, Sakyamappa replied. "May I know who your highness wants Li to find?" Li Daochong asked calmly. "Ben Wang's mother," Sakyamappa said again. Li Daochong was stunned. He did not expect that the person he was looking for was the prince's mother. "His Highness is the Prince of Jiuyo. Isn't your mother the concubine of the King of Jiuyo? How could an imperial concubine go missing so easily?" Li Daochong did not understand. "I've embarrassed myself in front of you, Mr. Li. Although Ben Wang's mother is noble, her level is not very high. She is only a devil general, a low-level one at that. Therefore, when the path of immortality first opened 1,000 years ago, she entered to look for His Majesty. However, she disappeared after entering. 1,000 years later, the path of immortality opened 10 times. Ben Wang sent countless confidants to search for His Majesty's whereabouts. But there was no news until the last time it opened, when someone found some clues. All kinds of signs pointed to the possibility that His Majesty's mother went astray the first time she entered the path of immortality and entered the collapsed immortal realm. As a result, she could not return, Sakyamappa continued. Li Daochong's original body, which was standing in the mine, smiled slightly. After hearing this, there was not much value to be found. Li is very interested in the immortal's inheritance and can cooperate with His Highness. However, Li wants to make it clear in advance that Li is only looking for people. If you encounter a devil of the Hades, Li will kill him without hesitation, Li Daochong said with a straight face. Sakyamappa smiled slightly. "Okay, Ben Wang only wants to find His Majesty's mother. Everything else is up to Mr. Li." Li Daochong responded and did not say anything else. "Mr. Li, deposit. Ben Wang will be teleported to Black Jupiter soon. Check it." As soon as he finished speaking, the divine telekinesis connection between the two was immediately cut off. Li Daochong was ejected from the sea of consciousness. His original body slowly opened his eyes and looked at the pitch-black mine in front of him. Li Daochong's body was already soaked in sweat, as if he had just fallen into water. Sakyamappa's divine telekinesis was extremely powerful and had been suppressing Li Daochong. Fortunately, he could cut off the connection at any time. Otherwise, he would have been attacked by Sakyamappa's demonic telekinesis. Li Daochong took a moment to recover. When he probed the spatial rift with his divine telekinesis again, the demonic chi inside was greatly weakened. Li Daocheng easily cleared away all the remaining demonic qi, and the spatial rift's opening quickly appeared. It was exactly the same as when Li Daocheng first came to Black Jupiter. As long as he crossed it, Li Daocheng could return a blue base star. Seeing the way back open, he was immediately overjoyed. Li Daocheng had really had enough of Black Jupiter. This place had been isolated for so many years and was full of pedantry and backwardness. It was not difficult for the Ghost Palace to pass through the spatial rift. As long as he sensed the spatial rift on Blue Base Star, he could activate the Transfer Spirit Array and transfer the Ghost Palace over. When Hu Ling saw the spatial rift open, she could not help but hug Li Daocheng and give him a big kiss. This time, Li Daocheng had played a major role in returning for Black Tree Star. If he had not come, Hu Ling and Lu Mei would probably have died of old age here, or they would have died to the dark ghosts after being discovered by the Hades. The two demonic qi had been killed, and the demonic qi on Black Jupiter had dissipated. There should not be any threat in the short term. The surviving Spirit Sea cultivators completely submitted to Li Daocheng. When Li Daocheng returned, some of the older cultivators knelt down and kowtowed, respectfully calling Li Daocheng their savior. This title made Li Daocheng feel very awkward. After all, this title was a bit too big. Just as Li Daocheng activated the Spirit Array in the Ghost Palace and prepared to transfer the Ghost Palace through the spatial rift to Blue Bay Star, suddenly, a tremor came from the mine. Li Daocheng felt that something was wrong. He handed over the transfer task to Xie Baoshan and Hu Ling again and returned to the spatial rift to investigate. He saw the space here begin to collapse, and a terrifying demonic qi came from the endless abyss. Li Daocheng frowned. A black shockwave came from the depths of the darkness. Li Daocheng did not have time to take out Song ink. His eyes flashed with blue-gold light, and he instantly activated the Eye of Thunder Punishment. Kaboom! Two bolts of yang thunder shot out from his eyes and collided with the black shockwave. The two opposing forces collided, and the mine was almost blown to the sky. If Li Daocheng had not been cautious and had not placed a spiritual force barrier around the spatial rift in advance, the explosion would have been over. This time, the spatial rift was blown away. Whoosh! A black shadow shot out from the endless abyss. When Li Daocheng saw the black shadow, his eyes flashed with a cold light. He cursed in his heart. He had fallen into a trap. At first, the black shadow was just a cloud of black fog. When the black fog dissipated, a robed old man appeared in front of Li Daocheng. This was the old man who had been standing to the side without saying a word when Li Daocheng and Sakyamapa formed a spiritual force connection. At this time, Li Daocheng realized that Shura Kasayapa was simply stalling for time with him. His goal was to lure the old man to Blackwood Star. Li Daocheng, His Majesty really thinks highly of you. In order to kill you, he personally came to buy time. In order to make you less suspicious, he even told you so many secrets. At first, this king thought he was making a mountain out of a molehill. Now, it seems that His Majesty is really good at foreseeing things. You really are not easy to deal with. Letting you go back to the human realm is like letting a tiger back into the mountains. It wasn't easy for you to come to the Hades, so don't even think about leaving, said the old man eerily. After Li Daocheng cut off his connection with Sakyamapa, he vaguely felt that something was wrong. There was no sign of the deposit Sakyamapa promised. Nonsense really could not be trusted. The old man's appearance did not cause Li Daocheng to panic. His spiritual force sensed that the old man was not the main body, but a demonic doppelganger. Li Daocheng had once read in an ancient text that a Devil King-level nether devil could gather the aura of death together and send a demonic doppelganger into it, using the powerful Devil King's demonic doppelganger. This was slightly different from cultivators creating doppelgangers, but the effect was the same. Most of the aura of death on the surface of Blackwood Star had been destroyed. Only the endless abyss still retained the aura of death that had accumulated over 2,000 years. Not only that, but there was still some demonic doppelganger left behind when the immortals of Blackwood Star fought the eternal devil emperors. The old man had used this demonic doppelganger to form his doppelganger. To think that a prince would resort to such despicable means. I've learned something new, Li Daochong sneered. Despicable? Ha ha. The old man threw his head back and laughed. Compared to you cultivators, this little trick is nothing. In terms of despicability, Li Daochong, you're not the least bit lacking. You even dared to scheme and steal the woman that His Highness has taken a fancy to. Isn't that despicable? Li Daochong's face darkened. He could not be bothered to talk nonsense with the other party. There was no reason to speak with devils of the Hades. It was not that Li Daochong did not have his suspicions when he was conversing with Sakyamapa. It was just that the information that the former had revealed was so shocking that he had no choice but to stop. The old man had also said that Sakyamapa was not making things up. Li Daochong did not dare to say that everything was true, but at least part of it was true. The demonic doppelganger on the old man was not any weaker than the two devils from before. It was just that Li Daochong did not understand why the old man did not trigger the 9 heavens primordial lightning when he appeared. Li Daochong, no matter what other cards you have, today is the day you die, the old man viciously said. As he spoke, the demonic doppelganger erupted from the old man's body. His body violently wriggled and grew. Ka ka ka. Terrifying sounds of bones growing came from his body. Soon, the old man transformed into a 100-foot-tall demonic body. It was somewhat similar to the demonic python's demonic body. The cultivators in the ghost palace also sensed the changes. They did not know what was happening outside. Some people wanted to come out and investigate, but they were stopped by Hu Ling. Li Daochong had already sent her a sound transmission. He told her to focus on transferring the ghost palace through the space crack. She did not care about anything else and did not allow anyone to move the ghost palace. Hu Ling unnaturally did as she was told. The ghost palace successfully passed through the space crack and arrived at a certain space underneath Blue Bay Star. After Hu Ling successfully transferred the ghost palace, she immediately came out. However, what she saw was that the space crack had disappeared. Fairy Jiuli, Lu Mei, and a few others followed Hu Ling. Exalted immortal Hu. How did the space crack disappear? Fairy Jiuli was confused. Hu Ling gently shook her head. She did not know why it disappeared. Chapter 714. Li Daochong looked at the disappearing spatial crack with a trace of anxiety in his eyes. The old man did not immediately attack Li Daochong. Instead, he used some unknown underworld technique to seal the spatial crack. Li Daochong did not intend to fight to the death. He was only waiting for the ghost manor to be successfully transferred. Then, he would immediately use the 1,000 sound escape to return a Blue Bay Star. Underworld demons could not exist under pure spiritual energy laws. However, Li Daochong did not expect the old man to be able to seal the spatial crack in an instant. Li Daochong's heart was in turmoil. This time, he had been tricked by Sakyamapa. Li Daochong still thought that Sakyamapa's intention to cooperate was real. However, he did not expect that cooperation was just a pretense. Fortunately, Sakyamapa's words were true so that he would not be suspicious. Li Daochong revealed a bitter smile. This Prince Hades' scheming was not ordinary. He was already careful enough, but he still fell for it. Actually, it was still his desire. Li Daochong was tempted by Sakyamapa's conditions and the immortal's inheritance. Although Li Daochong could not use the items provided for cultivation, he could still use them to make talismans and exchange them for materials, as well as the people around him. Li Daochong had relied on luck to kill the two demons. He had relied on the Nirvana Spirit magnetic gun and lightning tribulation. Without these two prerequisites, Li Daochong would not have been a match for the two demons. Although this Elder Ming MO was only a clone, his strength was still above the twin devils. Li Daochong knew that he had no chance of winning if he fought head-on. After the spatial crack disappeared, Li Daochong did not hesitate at all. He immediately used the 1,000 sound escape to fly away at his fastest speed. The most important secret on Black Jupiter Star had already been transferred to Blue Bay Star. Li Daochong did not have any worries. The old man did not expect Li Daochong to turn around and run without saying anything. He immediately chased after him. However, Li Daochong's speed was not something a void refinement cultivator should have. Not only was the old man unable to close the distance, he was even left further and further behind. Li Daochong, you can't escape. The space here has been sealed. Seeing that he could not catch up, the old man said angrily. Li Daochong acted as if he did not hear him. Instead, he increased his speed. Regardless of Li Daochong's cultivation, as long as he used the 1,000 sonic escape at his maximum speed, he would only be able to maintain it for 20 minutes or so. Once he exceeded that limit, he would be exhausted of the Hades as the Hades. However, Blackwood Planet was sealed by a gelatinous barrier, and there was no way to directly pass through it. Once the barrier rebounded or restricted him, Elder Mingma would immediately catch up. Li Daochong could only rush toward the Spirit Sea. Seeing that he could not catch up, Elder Mingma was not in a hurry. Although Mo Jitian and Zhou Luoyin were dead, they had already figured out the situation on Black Jupiter Star. Elder Mingma knew that Li Daochong could only wander around Black Jupiter Star. It was impossible for him to escape. The only loophole was the gap created by the two devils. At this moment, Li Daochong was running towards that gap. You want to escape? Hee, Li Daochong, you wish. Old Man Ming and Mo laughed sinisterly. There was a mark left by the two devils. With a thought, Elder Mingma teleported to the gap. Li Daochong had used his lightning power to seal the gap. However, Li Daochong's seal could not be compared to an immortal seal. Elder Mingma stretched out his hand, and a ball of black fog appeared in his palm. He tossed it gently, and the black fog rolled into the gap. After that, Elder Mingmo's eyes flashed, and he disappeared from where he stood. A few minutes later, Li Daochong appeared at the bottom of the gap. His breathing was ragged. Using the 1,000 sound escape at full power consumed a lot of energy. Although Li Daochong had sealed the gap again, he was the one who had set up the lightning net. It was easy for him to pass through it. Just as Li Daochong was about to rush out of the gap and leave Black Jupiter Star, his divine telekinesis sensed a strange fluctuation. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Li Daochong's body flashed with electricity, creating intense friction with the surrounding air. It was as if the sky was going to ignite. This was the effect of Li Daochong's sudden braking while flying at high speed. Li Daochong stopped a few meters away from the gap. A bluish gold light flashed in his eyes. Heavenly lightning art, true thunder eye. Li Daochong immediately saw an extremely hidden spatial door in the middle of the gap. If he had ignored it and entered the gap, he would have entered the spatial door and been caught red-handed. Li Daochong didn't know what was on the other side of the spatial door, but it definitely wasn't a place he wanted to go. Li Daochong glanced at it and sensed that something was wrong. He immediately turned around and shot out again. Not long after Li Daochong left, the void in the distance flashed. Elder Mingma's figure gradually became clearer. What a pity. Li Daochong, you are extraordinarily cautious. Elder Mingma muttered to himself with a hint of regret. With his path blocked, Li Daochong's spirit chi was rapidly depleting. However, he couldn't stop. Without the protection of the Ghost Manor, Li Daochong only had to stop for Elder Mingma to immediately chase after him. It was very difficult for Li Daochong to completely conceal his aura. As long as there was a trace missing, it wouldn't be able to escape the Devil King's devil consciousness. Blackwood Star was boundless to mortals. Even Foundation establishment cultivators couldn't imagine how big it was. They wouldn't be able to cross the endless mountain range or the vast wilderness even after decades. However, to cultivators at the level of Yuanying, Blackwood Star wasn't that big. Of course, to void refinement cultivators or Devil Kings, Blackwood Star was only the size of Capital City. It wouldn't take more than 2 hours to travel from one side to the other. A Devil King's devil consciousness could easily cover the entire Blackwood Star. Even Li Daochong could easily do this, let alone a Devil King. His divine consciousness was enough to detect any area on Blackwood Star. For example, Li Daochong could now sense that Elder Mingma was more than 300 kilometers away from him in the void. Li Daochong flew crazily on the spirit sea. Just as he was at his wit's end and didn't know where to escape to, a thundercloud appeared in front of him. The sea in front of him was in a thunderstorm. Li Daochong's eyes flickered, and he adjusted his flying direction slightly. His main body flew in another direction. At the same time, he created dozens of divine consciousness clones, which emitted the same spirit chi as his main body, and they spread in different directions. The speed of the divine consciousness clones was comparable to the speed of the spread of his divine consciousness. It was almost on par with Li Daochong's 1,000-sound escape technique. A few minutes later, Li Daochong's main body appeared in the sky above Sky Thunder Island. Li Daochong smiled as he looked at the thundercloud in the sky, which was even thicker than before. It was indeed similar to what he had expected. After Blackwood Star regained its spirit chi nomological environment, the thundercloud in the sky above Sky Thunder Island became larger than before. The power of the heavenly lightning that fell was also several times stronger. The lightning that fell from a thundercloud in the sky above Sky Thunder Island was neither the nine heavens primordial lightning nor the tribulation lightning. Instead, it was a type of spirit lightning that was condensed in a specific environment. Li Daochong did not land on the island. Instead, he dove into the sea region below Sky Thunder Island. Li Daochong continued to dive until he was 1,000 meters below the sea level. He then drilled into the seabed foundation of Sky Thunder Island. Sky Thunder Island had been baptized by heavenly lightning for over 2,000 years. The space here was already enveloped by the spirit lightning magnetic field, which caused an extremely strong interference to devil will detection. After Li Daochong drilled into the seabed foundation of Sky Thunder Island, he immediately sealed the hole he drilled out of. The seabed foundation, 1,000 meters below the sea level, had an extremely dense spirit lightning magnetic field, which just happened to envelop Li Daochong. After activating the 1,000-sound escape technique for a long time, Li Daochong's spirit chi was almost depleted. His body was extremely tired. In addition, after coming to Blackwood Star, Li Daochong had always been in a tense state. He had no time to rest and adjust his breathing. After the battle with the two devils, he had expended a large amount of spirit chi to establish a soul remembrance connection with the Nine Serenity Prince. The moment he withdrew, he encountered a reversal. He was chased by a Devil King avatar formed from Devil Will that was even stronger than the two devils. He then used the 1,000-sound escape technique and flew at top speed for 20 minutes. After Li Daochong sealed the hole, he could no longer hold on and fell into a deep sleep. Outside, Elder Ming Mo sensed dozens of Li Daochong auras that were exactly the same. He realized that the situation was not right. However, no matter how powerful Elder Ming Mo was, he could only send out small devil will avatars to chase after dozens of auras. After a day and night, Elder Ming Mo still lost track of Li Daochong. The latter seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Elder Ming Mo was incomparably furious. He felt that he had been played by Li Daochong, who had tried to destroy the entire Blackwood Star. However, he did not attack in the end. Elder Ming Mo was the #1 Devil King of Sakyamapa's 12 Devil Kings, Yama Devil King. He knew the value of Blackwood Star. This place hid a secret that even Hades might be afraid of. Therefore, he could not destroy Blackwood Star before he found out what it was. Yama Devil King's Devil Will avatar sat quietly on a mountain near the edge of the Endless Mountain Range. His Devil Will covered the entire Blackwood Star. He would immediately sense any movement. Just like that, 1 day passed. 2 days passed. 5 days passed. 10 days passed. 1 month passed. 2 months passed. Chapter 715. 3 months passed by in the blink of an eye. Li Daochong, who was sleeping under the Sky Thunder Island, was covered in dust. He looked like a dead person without breathing or heartbeat. However, as long as a cultivator reached the gene dance stage, they would not need to eat, drink, sleep, or even breathe. The source of all energy was spiritual energy. At this moment, Li Daochong was still sleeping. He had consumed too much energy during this period of time. Of course, Li Daocheng's inner world was not in a silent state. His primordial spirit sat cross-legged and floated in mid-air with his eyes closed. Pure spiritual energy constantly flowed throughout his body, occasionally creating sparks. The spiritual energy that was scattered throughout his inner world constantly gathered at one point. Li Daocheng had not used the psychokinesis battle technique for a long time. During these 3 months, he had spent all his energy on regulating his breathing. After breaking through several stages, Li Daocheng had not stabilized his cultivation and was still fighting in an unstable state. This caused Li Daocheng's primordial spirit to be somewhat overdrawn. After 3 months of stabilizing, it finally stabilized. However, this was not enough. The next step was to stabilize his cultivation and cleanse his spiritual body. The void refinement stage, and the spirit to return to the void. The void refinement stage was the most important stage for a cultivator to have a greater breakthrough in the future. It was also the watershed for a cultivator to become a true high-level cultivator. The void refinement stage was more meticulous than any other stage. This brought a lot of difficulties to cultivators in this stage. Li Daocheng naturally understood this principle. Therefore, he would not wake up if he did not achieve the best results during this period of regulating his breathing. Although Li Daocheng did not need to cultivate to improve his cultivation, Li Daocheng did not need to cultivate with the help of the hot-blooded level-up device. However, comprehension and refinement were more important than any other cultivator. When Li Daocheng's level was still very low, there were 2 situations where he almost died because he did not consolidate his cultivation in time. The higher the cultivation, the longer the refinement time. Li Daocheng was not in a hurry. During these 3 months, Li Daocheng only woke up once on the 3rd day. The reason Li Daocheng woke up was because he was worried that the Hades would invade Black Tree, Star, en masse. Apparently, after the fiendish python, the emissary of Hades, the twin demons, and the elder Mingma, the Blackwood Star was no longer a secret. It was impossible that the Hades could not be found. Of course, Li Daocheng did not have to worry too much about finding Black Jupiter. After all, the immortal seal was still there. It would not be easy to break it, especially from the outside in. If he tried to force his way in, there was a chance that some spirit array in the seal would be triggered, which would directly attack him. The problem was that the 2 devils had opened a gap from the inside out. This gap was enough for the Hades to invade Black Jupiter on a large scale and assimilate it into a dead planet once more. Because of the existence of this gap, Li Daocheng's slumber was not peaceful. Once the Hades invaded Black Jupiter, he would not be able to sleep peacefully. If the Hades invaded Black Jupiter, Li Daocheng would be discovered sooner or later and become a turtle in a jar. After Li Daocheng woke up, he immediately separated a wisp of his divine sense and sent it thousands of kilometers away in the sea. Only then did he emerge from the bottom of the sea to explore the gap. If the Hades invaded Black Jupiter through the gap, Li Daocheng could not continue to sleep and had to make other plans. However, to Li Daocheng's surprise, when he saw the gap again 3 days later, he found that it had shrunk a lot. The thunder net he had set up had integrated into the gelatinous seal. The seal could repair itself. Not only that, after the spiritual energy of Black Jupiter was restored, the gelatinous seal was much stronger than before. The aura of Li Daocheng's divine sense was extremely weak, not much stronger than a small insect. Li Daocheng stayed near the gap for a whole day and night. During this time, the elder Mingma appeared twice, seemingly trying to find a way to prevent the gap from repairing itself, but to no avail. How could an immortal's spell be so easily broken? When Li Daocheng's strand of divine sense dissipated, the gap had already been completely sealed. The seal had the ability to repair itself, which was to be expected. Since the immortals had set up such a powerful seal, they naturally wanted to seal Black Jupiter for a long time. It was hard to say that such a large seal would not be destroyed after 2,000 years. How could the immortals not think of leaving behind a backup plan? After confirming that the Hades would not be able to invade Black Jupiter for a while, Li Daocheng finally felt at ease and went back to sleep. During these 3 months, the Yama King's divine sense did not remain idle. He used all kinds of methods to search for Li Daochong, but to no avail. He even used dark arts, but still could not sense Li Daochong's existence. At the same time, the Blue Bay Star was facing an unprecedented crisis. With Li Daochong's strong support, the Li family expanded their business to the entire Federation in just over a year. They also gradually infiltrated the 3 cultivation empires, especially in the area of talismans and elixirs. 3 of the Li Group's subsidiaries had already been successfully listed. This kind of development speed had never happened before in the history of the Shenghua Federation. Even in the 3 cultivation empires, they were a business legend. As the saying went, a tall tree attracts the wind. Naturally, no one on the Blue Bay Star dared to provoke the Li family, nor could they afford to. But outside the Blue Bay Star, no one cared. After all, no one knew that Li Daochong was the Rado Shinji, who had slaughtered everyone on 13 Spectre and become the idol of countless young cultivators. In fact, even if they knew that Rado Shinji was from the Blue Bay Star's Li family, they could only intimidate the Shenghua Federation. Soul formation cultivators were just small fries in the 3 cultivation empires. In the business world, it was inevitable that they would infringe on the interests of others. The Li family had risen too quickly. The faster they swallowed up the interests of others, the greater the conflicts they would cause. The Li family's 3 major businesses, talismans, elixirs, and star soul crystals, had swallowed 2/3 of the Shenghua Federation's market in just over a year, and they were still expanding, unstoppable. If this situation continued, the Li family would become the only cultivation company in the Shenghua Federation to engage in these 3 major businesses. In the past year, more than 100 cultivation-related businesses had closed down because of this. Those that were still alive were some big companies, but their living conditions had been compressed to the limit. One of them was the secret protector of Shenghua Mining, the first soul formation cultivator of the Shenghua Federation who had lived in seclusion for more than 100 years, Lord Silverflame. Although the Shenghua Federation had a federation government, the actual controllers were a few soul formation cultivators who were hiding behind the scenes. Lord Silverflame was the most powerful of them. Almost as soon as the Shenghua Federation was established, he was already one of the core figures of the Federation. In the following hundreds of years, his cultivation level kept improving, and he finally became the real ruler of the Shenghua Federation. It was just that after reaching the soul formation stage, every step forward would consume a lot of resources. Cultivation also took time. A closed-door cultivation would take at least a few months, a few years, or at most decades. A single closed-door cultivation was a lifetime for a mortal. Therefore, after reaching the soul formation stage, a barren place like the Shenghua Federation was no longer suitable. The Shenghua Federation still had 3 or 4 soul formation cultivators who could occasionally show their faces, but most of the time, they were not in the Federation's territory. Instead, they were looking for opportunities in the 3 major cultivation empires, seeking jobs, or traveling to the major cultivation planets to trade magic treasures and elixirs. Because of the rise of the Li family, Lord Silverflame's resources had been greatly reduced in the past year. This forced this soul formation cultivator who was traveling outside to have to come back to take charge of government affairs. 3 days ago, Shenghua Mining officially launched a counterattack. Tianyang Mining, a subsidiary of the Li family, lost 3 major mines in 3 days. They were attacked by unknown cultivators and suffered heavy losses. Not only that, but other companies in the Shenghua Federation also joined forces to resist the rise of the Li family. It was not a big deal to be ostracized by the same business. Many shareholders of the Li family suddenly sold their shares and left. Some shareholders who were unwilling to sell their shares would mysteriously disappear for a period of time. When they reappeared, they were much more obedient. The direct members of the Li family were attacked by unknown people, and an elder was arrested on a groundless charge. What was more troublesome was that many powerful cultivators suddenly appeared on the Blue Bay Star. This small fourth-class cultivation planet used to be difficult to even see a single Jindan cultivator. Now, however, Yuaning cultivators were everywhere. A cultivation company called Shidama Security, which specialized in bodyguard business, rose from the ground and interfered in the affairs of the Blue Bay Star. The local government of the Blue Bay Star couldn't do anything about this security company. As long as they didn't hire the security company's cultivators, it would be difficult for the company to operate normally. In addition to the Shanghua Federation's ostracization of the Li family, an organization from the three major cultivation empires also infiltrated the Blue Bay Star. For some reason, they also encircled the Li family. This cultivation company called Emperor was extremely barbaric. Relying on the fact that they were from the Nkuan Empire, they did business like bandits. If they didn't do business, they would start fighting without a word. The Federation government didn't dare to interfere at all, because this Emperor Corporation was a super cultivation company in the Nkuan Empire. There were void refinement cultivators and even a fusion stage cultivator among the higher-ups of the company. This kind of power was far beyond the limits of what the Shanghua Federation could handle. The Li family was attacked from both sides, but it wasn't that they didn't have any allies. For example, the Qiang family and the Federation's Wei family were the Li family's staunchest allies. However, they also suffered a huge blow because of this. The Wei family didn't dare to go too far, because Wei Beitong was an alchemist. The family was different. A family on a mere fourth-class planet wasn't even worth mentioning in the eyes of those forces. With just a little bit of force, the family was squeezed until they couldn't breathe. The family corporation only lasted for a month before it went bankrupt. If it wasn't for the protection of a few Jindan cultivators from the Qiang Star, the family would have already disbanded. Father, if the major shareholders continue to sell their shares like this, it won't be long before we hand over the actual control of the Li Family Corporation to someone else. Li Qingyao sat in a conference room on the top floor of the Li Family building and looked at Li Tianyang with a worried expression. Someone is deliberately playing tricks behind the scenes to deal with the Li Family Corporation. Tianyang, as far as I know, there's more than one force behind this, and each of them has a strong background. We can't fight against them at all. In my opinion, why don't we reduce our business scope and reorganize it, only expanding our business within the fourth ring starfield? Liamo said in a slightly cowardly manner. A few days ago, he heard from a merchant that the one who wanted to deal with the Li family was Lord Silverflame. Hearing this name, Liamo was already terrified. Yes, Director Li, let's make money peacefully. Now that we've offended so many big shots, we're the ones who ate their cake. As long as we put down the knife, they'll stop too, another shareholder said. Bang! Just as the shareholders were speaking one after another, the door to the conference room was violently pushed open. A young man in brown martial attire hurriedly walked in and said with a flustered expression, Director Li, the cultivators of the Misty Shadow sect are causing trouble. They said that our huge advertisement on Zhongxing Street blocked their line of sight. Li Ying and the others were injured. Chapter 716. The young man who rushed into the meeting room was Li He, the only one who dared to stand up for Li Daochong when Li Daochong was bullied by the Li family. However, Li had his leg broken by Li Tianyao when he stood up for Li Daochong. After that, he didn't dare to stand up for Li Daochong anymore. However, Li had helped Li Daochong a lot in the past. This was also the reason why Li Tianyang and Li Daochong put Li He in an important position after they regained control of the Li family. Li's position in the Li family group wasn't very high. He was only the manager of a branch company. However, he had another identity as Li Tianyang's assistant. This identity was very special. He often participated in the decision-making of the Li family group. In addition to Li He, there was another person in the younger generation who was also put in an important position. When Li Daochong and Li Qingyao were kicked out of the family, she provided a lot of help. She was Li Ling. Among the direct descendants of the Li family, she was the female representative. Now, with a lot of resources, she was only one step away from Jindan. Li Tianyang, Li Mubai, Li Zhen, Li Din, Li Qingyao, Li He, and Li Ling. These 7 people were the core of the Li family. Li Tianyang and Li Qingyao didn't need to be mentioned. One was Li Daocheng's father, and the other was his sister. The other 5 were either those who had helped Li Daocheng in the past, or those who had overthrown the pests led by Li Longbo 2 years ago. These 7 people also became the leaders of the Li family group. Of course, the real protection behind them was Li Daocheng. The Li family group was able to develop so quickly. Li Tianyang's management couldn't go unnoticed. However, without Li Daocheng's large amount of financial resources, no matter how talented Li Tianyang was, it was impossible for the Li group to develop so quickly. Li Daocheng not only provided strong financial support, but also continuously sent talents to the Li group. Li Daocheng had single-handedly built the entire security system of the Li group. Li Daocheng had 3 disciples in name, Xiaoying, Ling Fei, and Xiaoling River. When the Blood Knife Society was destroyed, the Blood Ape King and the Golden Lion King's soul consciousness were erased, but their demon bodies were still there. Of course, without their soul consciousness, they became demon beasts. These 2 demonic beasts had contributed greatly to the development of the Li family, as well as the 8 Hall Masters of the Blood Knife Society. 3 months ago, when Yin Ping and the others returned, the Li family's strength had reached an extremely terrifying level. Of course, the outside world didn't know about this. Cherry Blossom Gauze alone was enough to wipe out the entire Federation. He was considered an expert in the 3 great cultivation empires. However, Cherry Blossom Gauze's identity was too special. He couldn't be exposed, and his terrifying strength couldn't be easily shown to others. Li Tianyang knew this better than anyone else. Therefore, after Cherry Blossom Gauze returned, he only had one job, to be Yin Ping's personal bodyguard. As for Yin Ping's position, Li Tianyang arranged it to be extremely high. As a father, how could he not know his son's thoughts? Li Tianyang had long seen that Li Daocheng's feelings for Yin Ping were not ordinary. It had long surpassed the feelings of master and servant. Yin Ping didn't have a good background and was a card slave. In the entire human territory, card slaves were inevitably discriminated against. It was extremely difficult for the weak to be respected. However, Li Tianyang knew that with Li Daocheng's support, Yin Ping would certainly achieve great things. Even though Li Tianyang was mentally prepared, he was still taken aback when Yin Ping returned. Li Tianyang had never dreamed that Yin Ping would be able to reach the Yuanying stage in such a short time with her card slave aptitude. In terms of cultivation, Yin Ping had already surpassed Li Tianyang. The latter relied on his talent and Li Daocheng's large amount of resources in the later stage. Li Tianyang had already broken through to the Yuanying stage a few months ago and became a Yuanying cultivator. Yin Ping, on the other hand, had already reached the late Yuanying stage. Moreover, her foundation was extremely solid, and her personality had also changed significantly. In Li Tianyang's impression, Yin Ping was a well-behaved, timid, inflexible but loyal card slave. However, after returning this time, Yin Ping's personality had changed greatly. Li Tianyang almost suspected that this girl's soul had been possessed. Yin Ping was no longer afraid, nor was she submissive. Moreover, she had goals and ideals. For a card slave who had been sold as a slave from a young age, it was unimaginable that she would have her own thoughts. In fact, all card slaves were cowards who didn't have many thoughts. This was their innate nature. They were like sheep. No matter what, they couldn't develop a wolf's nature. However, Yin Ping had a rare trace of a wolf's nature. After Yin Ping returned, Li Tianyang immediately made her the chief financial officer of the Li family group. At the same time, she was also a director of the group. It seemed that Li Tianyang was a little careless. After all, Yin Ping had no management experience and didn't know anything about finance. She was still young. However, Li Tianyang had put a lot of thought into this arrangement. This was because all the funds and resources provided by Li Daocheng had all gone through Yin Ping's hands. In other words, Yin Ping was actually in control of the financial lifeline. The Li family's money had to go through her hands. Li Daochong trusted Yin Ping even more than Li Tianyang. As a father, he didn't have any objections. In the future, Yin Ping would really marry Li Daochong and become the Li family's daughter-in-law. It wouldn't be a problem for her to be in charge of the financial power. Therefore, Li Tianyang specially arranged the position of chief financial officer for Yin Ping. To put it bluntly, she was the boss of the Li family group's money. Many people in the group didn't agree with this. First of all, Yin Ping was too young. In most people's eyes, she was just a little girl. Secondly, not many people knew about her close relationship with Li Daochong. Lastly, Yin Ping's card slave bloodline made people very unhappy. After Li Tianyang appointed Yin Ping, he didn't worry about people disagreeing. Even if the girl's personality was a little weak, with cherry blossom gauze, woo-ho, no one could touch Yin Ping. It was just that Li Tianyang didn't expect that Yin Ping would be able to subdue the people who opposed her without cherry blossom gauze doing anything. Yin Ping's method wasn't complicated. It could be summarized in 4 words. First, peaceful means, then force. Li Tianyang couldn't estimate how many treasures were in Yin Ping's storage ring. Yin Ping began to make a move on the people who opposed her on the first day, using all kinds of reasons to meet them. All the necessary etiquette was present. The move of giving gifts suppressed most of the voices. The things Yin Ping gave weren't common goods. Each one of them was enough to change the person's life. A spirit pill could raise your cultivation by 1 stage. A magic treasure could double your battle prowess. A cultivation technique could allow you to get rid of your mediocre aptitude. And a spirit stone could make you rich. A high-level spirit stone was a huge fortune on Blue Bay Star. Even Li Tianyang hadn't seen one in many years. Few people were willing to refuse these gifts. Of course, there were still a few stubborn ones. There were also a few people who accepted the gifts. On the surface, they were on good terms with you, but they were still playing tricks behind your back. Yin Ping dealt with them steadily, accurately, and ruthlessly. Directly attacking them was the last resort. Yin Ping's method wasn't that simple and crude. Instead, she started from their weaknesses and soft spots. For example, a shareholder had a relative who worked in the government, but had accepted bribes. Yin Ping was a late-stage Yuanying, so it was easy for her to find evidence. Soon, the shareholder was terrified. Not only did he strongly support Yin Ping, but he also returned the gifts intact. How would he dare to accept any gifts? This incident made Li Tianyang have a whole new level of respect for Yin Ping. He was relieved to hand over the chief financial officer's job to Yin Ping. In addition to cherry blossom gauze, there was also an old man by Yin Ping's side. This old man looked old and clumsy, as if he was going to die at any time. However, Li Tianyang always felt that there was an inexplicable danger from this person. The old man was none other than old ancestor Tianfeng, who was saved by Yin Ping. It was just that his injuries were extremely serious. Yin Ping had spent a lot of money to save him. It was with great difficulty that old ancestor Tianfeng didn't have to stay in the spiritual liquid vat all the time. Yi Feiyue and Huang Jiaran also came back with Yin Ping. The former was homeless and worked as a supervisor in a branch of the Li Group. Huang Jiaran's identity was a little special. After Li Tianyang understood, he put her in charge of the Scarlet Sun Planet's business. Li Daochong, as a hands-off shopkeeper, had a lot of free time, which made him the old man have a lot of headaches. 3 months ago, Yin Ping and the others weren't the only ones who returned. There was also a large group of outsiders. If Li Daochong hadn't sent a voice transmission to Yin Ping in advance, this group of outsiders would have been gone. Li Tianyang wouldn't have believed that Li Daochong would throw such a huge burden back. How to settle tens of thousands of foreign cultivators gave Li Tianyang a headache. Cherry Blossom Gauze also received Li Daochong's spiritual will sound transmission and learned about the Ghost Mansion. Hu Ling, and Yao Ling also became members of the Li Group. Li Tianyang didn't have any positions for them, so he let them become members of the security company under the Li Group. Xia Baoshan was a ghost cultivator. He couldn't show his face in public on a Blue Bay Star and could only stay in the Ghost Mansion. 3 days after the Ghost Mansion was transferred to the Blue Bay Star, it was officially taken over by Cherry Blossom Gauze. Xia Baoshan the master of the Ghost Mansion, became history. After leaving the Blackwood Star, all the cultivators on the Blackwood Star realized how short-sighted they were. Li Tianyong took in so many people, but his son didn't come back. Hu Ling, and the others vaguely described Li Daocheng's whereabouts, as if they were hiding something. Li Tianyong wasn't worried about Li Daocheng's return in the beginning. Until a month ago, the horn to encircle the Li group was blown everywhere. After Li Tianyong obtained information from many sources, he realized that if Li Daocheng didn't come back, the Li group would be in danger. Li Tianyong looked at Li He, who hurriedly pushed open the door and came in. He was already used to the situation reported by him. Li Tianyong glanced at Li He, but didn't give any instructions. He paused for a moment before asking, "What are the cultivators in the fog shadow?" "A total of 7 people. 5 Foundation Establishment cultivators and 2 Jin Dan cultivators." Li He immediately replied. Li Tianyong nodded slightly and waved his hand. "Tell Ling Fei to bring a few cultivators over. As long as they don't make a move, you guys don't make a move either. Let them make a ruckus." "Yes, sir," Li He replied and then retreated. Li Tianyong looked at Li He's departure and sighed his heart. In the past month, the fog shadow had been causing trouble for the Li group's companies and stores for various reasons. The conflict was constantly escalating. A few days ago, there was a duel, and one of the Li group's security personnel was seriously injured on the spot. Blue Bay Star's government didn't dare to interfere with the Fog Shadow Security Company. The Li group was only one step away from starting a war with the Fog Shadow Security Company. At first, Li Tianyong wasn't afraid of the Fog Shadow Security Company. After all, the Li group had a lot of unknown experts. Moreover, they still had Luo Yingsha as their trump card. Even if the Emperor group had the backing of the Kuan Empire, they would still be able to defeat them. Li Tianyong was confident that he could fight them head-on. As for Shanghua Mining, Li Tianyong didn't think much of them, even if they had Lord Silverflame behind them. However, the Fog Shadow Security Company was different. After many investigations, Li Tianyong obtained accurate information. The Dark Knight was behind the Fog Shadow Security Company. Li Tianyong learned from Yin Ping that the Dark Knight and Li Daocheng had completely formed a grudge over the Black Prison. Chapter 717. Time passed day by day. The news of Li Daocheng's disappearance had spread widely. Some powerful people in the Shenghua Federation knew that Li Daocheng of the Blue Bay Starly family was the Rado Shinji, who had stirred up a storm on 13 Spectre more than 2 years ago. It was also because of this reputation that many companies didn't dare to join the ranks of sanctions against the Li family. However, as time passed, the news of Li Daocheng's death became more and more credible. Half a year later, even many people in the Li family began to believe it. For Yin Ping, it had been 7 months since Li Daocheng had been trapped in the space vortex. For the Li family, Li Daocheng hadn't returned for nearly 3 years. The Li family was being ostracized more and more violently. In the first 4 months, Li Tianyong had relied on ruthless methods to maintain the situation for a while. In addition, he had a lot of trump cards. Among the cultivators in charge of security in the Li family group, there were 3 Yuanying cultivators: Hu Ling, Yin Ping, and Li Tianyong. There was 1 soul formation cultivator and 1 demon spirit. There were several Jin Dan cultivators and hundreds of Spirit Sea cultivators, but most of them were only at the early Jin Dan stage. Xia Baoshan was also at the early stage of Yuanying, but he was an out-and-out ghost cultivator. He couldn't be exposed, so he could only be excluded. Ever since the Li family's living space became tight 3 months ago, Li Tianyong summoned all the branches of the Federation to the Blue Bay Star. Among them, the biggest force was naturally the number 18 Talisman Technology Company, limited, controlled by Princess Catherine and Old Ghost Zhang. They controlled 70% of the low-level talisman industry in the Federation. Princess Catherine perfectly presented everything that Li Daocheng had asked her to do. Time flew by. Another 3 months passed in the blink of an eye. The Li family was suppressed time and time again. Li Tianyong personally took action to resist the enemy, but it was of no avail. Many people knew about Li Daocheng's experiences in the Black Prison, but few knew how Li Daocheng had fallen into the spatial rift. On the other side, Li Daocheng's consolidation of his cultivation had reached a critical stage. He had cut off all contact with the outside world. Even his five senses were shielded as he focused on refining his spirit into nothingness. During this period of time, his primordial spirit had become more and more substantial. Strictly speaking, it was not much different from his main body. His primordial spirit was completely condensed, and the embryonic form of the Yuan spirit golden body was cast. Once it was completed, it would be the final step to enter the form synthesis stage. 9 months later, Li Daocheng's crazy absorption of a large amount of spiritual energy stabilized. The amount of spiritual qi was enormous. Even Li Daocheng himself did not expect that he would consume more spiritual qi than himself. Li Daocheng reached the peak of the early stage void refinement realm in one fell swoop and was only one step away from the mid-stage void refinement realm. However, he did not know how and where he would take this step. Li Daocheng's strength had greatly improved compared to 9 months ago. The Thunder Nascent soul had grown to half the size of a human. Originally, the Thunder Nascent soul was fused with his primordial spirit. This time, Li Daocheng separated the Thunder Nascent soul from his primordial spirit and formed a new nascent Thunder Nascent soul independently. Li Daocheng planned to cultivate the nascent Thunder Nascent soul into another primordial spirit condensed by the power of Yang Thunder. In this way, Li Daocheng's cultivation would be far thicker than that of cultivators of the same level. Li Daocheng recomprehended the Great Void sword technique again. In the past 9 months, Li Daocheng had eaten all the spiritual herbs that he could eat. The last one was the Ice Spirit Pill, a 2-star essence refining pill, and a Spirit Soul Pill. These spiritual herbs were mainly used to strengthen the body and further purify the spirit body. Li Daocheng woke up for half a month in the middle. This time, he was also forced to wake up. However, it was not because of any danger in the outside world. Instead, it was because the Shabi that had been knocked unconscious a few months ago had finally woken up from its deep sleep. The Shabi's self-healing and self-evolving abilities were even better than Li Daocheng's. Although the little thing had suffered in the ghost manner, it had devoured many powerful dead souls before. That included the Soul Catcher Ghost. Therefore, even though it had been beaten very badly, after entering a deep sleep state, the Shabi's body was covered in a layer of cocoon-like things. After waking up this time, the Shabi's improvement was not as shocking as before. Most of the power of the dead souls it had devoured was used to heal its injuries. However, it had still evolved by a small realm and could transform into a 4-meter-tall giant ape. After Li Daocheng thoroughly nourished the Shabi with spirit qi, he also replenished Shui and I with a large amount of spirit qi, allowing this elf to recover to its peak state. Shui and I had now become Tsang Ink's artifact spirit. Every time she evolved, Tsang Ink would also improve. After 9 months, Li Daocheng woke up once again. When he opened his eyes, everything around him had become clear, as if he could see through everything. His divine sense was twice as strong as before. Among all of Li Daocheng's abilities, his divine sense had always been the one that improved the fastest and most steadily. This time was no exception. Sitting in the foundation of Sky Thunder Island, Li Daocheng, who was far away from the sea, could still cover the entire Blackwood Star with his divine sense. He easily sensed that King Yama's avatar was still guarding a mountain peak at the edge of the endless mountain range. After 9 months, Li Daocheng's strength had greatly improved. However, he was still not a match for King Yama's avatar. Li Daocheng quietly pondered for a few days. Then, he took out the spirit magnetic gun that the demon spirit had given him and began to study it. Li Daocheng knew almost nothing about spirit magnetic guns. However, the spiritual brain he carried with him had stored many research books on spirit magnetic guns. After reading dozens of books, Li Daocheng focused on studying the production of spirit magnetic guns bullets. Relying on his memories, Li Daochong quickly deduced the composition of the bullets that had killed the two demons. He also found the relevant records. The two bullets were called Silver Soul. They were made by mixing 3 types of magic metals and 1 type of blood essence, according to the ratio. They were also reinforced with an extremely exquisite spiritual array. The 3 types of magic metals were magic silver, star soul crystal, and mixed yuan iron. The last type of blood essence was the blood essence of an ancient divine beast. The production materials were not complicated. Of the 3 types of magic metals, only magic silver was rare. However, it was not impossible to obtain. The real difficulty in producing Silver Soul was the blood essence of a divine beast and the exquisite miniature spiritual array. However, the 2 most difficult parts were very easy for Li Daochong to accomplish. The blood essence of a divine beast was extremely precious. 1 drop of blood essence was enough to produce 10 silver souls. As for engraving miniature spiritual arrays, Li Daochong's skill in making talismans was even higher than his cultivation. On the other hand, the 3 types of magic metals were Li Daochong's problem. He had almost nothing on him, let alone magic metals. However, Blackwood Star was very big. There was no doubt that it was rich in minerals. However, Blackwood Star was very big. Finding these 3 types of magic metals was like finding a needle in a haystack. After thinking about it, Li Daochong felt that if he wanted to defeat the Demon King's clone, he could only use 2 resources. One was to produce Silver Soul and shoot it to death. The other was to crush the Demon King's devil core in the extreme devil sky. Whether the second method could defeat the Demon King's clone was questionable. After Li Daochong reached the void refinement stage, the amount of spiritual qi he needed to increase his cultivation increased several times. After killing a Demon King, Li Daochong estimated that it would be good if he could advance by 1 small stage. Even if Li Daochong reached the mid-void refinement stage, he might not be a match for the Demon King's clone. He might even lose a Demon King's devil core for nothing. If this thing were to be sold in the black market or the 3 great cultivation empires, it could easily fetch a sky-high price. The Demon King's devil core had a wide range of uses. It could be used to create large-scale weapons with super destructive power. It could also be used as a source of energy for special spiritual machines. It could also be used as medicine. It could also be used as the core of a steel puppet. A steel puppet with a Demon King's devil core as its core could instantly kill a void refinement stage cultivator. Li Daochong didn't gain much from his trip to the Black Prison and then to Blackwood Star. Apart from the increase in his cultivation, he didn't have any extra income. Li Daochong was naturally unwilling. Moreover, destroying the Demon King's devil core didn't give him the confidence to win. Rather than wasting it, it was better to keep it. Obviously, it was more practical to make a few Silver Soul bullets. As long as he could find the 3 types of magic metals, Li Daochong would have a way to make Silver Soul bullets. However, he couldn't find any magic metals here. However, Li Daochong couldn't leave the seabed of Sky Thunder Island at all. Once he left, he would be instantly detected by the Demon King's clone. Just as Li Daochong was at his wit's end, a squeaking sound came from beside him. The little Shabai jumped up and down on the ground, as if it wanted to express something. Li Daochong looked puzzled. Then, he shot his spiritual force into the Shabai's spiritual sea. "You gonna find a mine?" Li Daochong asked in surprise. The little Shabai immediately nodded. "Clap." Li Daochong suddenly clapped his hands. "That's right. You can emit death aura while maintaining your original state. Your aura is very weak. The Demon King's clone doesn't know that I have a Shabai. As long as you don't transform, the Demon King's clone won't detect you." Squeak. The little Shabai seemed to understand Li Daochong's words and responded with squeaking sounds. Divine beasts were psychic, and the Shabai was no exception. When Li Daochong took the little Shabai in, they had already established a spiritual connection. Therefore, the Shabai could sense what Li Daochong was thinking. Li Daochong immediately took out the characteristics of the 3 types of magic metals from his spiritual brain and showed them to the Shabai. The little monkey blinked its big eyes at the spiritual brain's display and quickly memorized the characteristics. Li Daochong was still worried and transmitted the characteristics of the three types of magic metals to the Shabai through his spiritual force. After everything was done, the Shabai squeaked and rushed out of the cave. After the Shabai left, Li Daochong didn't just sit and wait. Instead, he carefully separated a bit of the Demon King's demonic core. Then, he took out all the remaining materials in his storage ring. These materials were all left over from Li Daochong's spiritual talismans. The materials were of different grades. There were more low-grade materials, fewer high-grade materials, and even fewer top-grade materials. Even if there were only dregs left. Li Daochong carefully categorized these materials, refined them, and mixed them. Then he separated his palm and took out a small bowl of his blood. The basic materials for making spiritual talismans were all complete. With the addition of the Demon King's demonic core powder and Li Daochong's spiritual blood, it was not impossible to make a high-grade spiritual talisman. The fastest mobile version of the website. Chapter 718. Li Daochong hadn't made talismans for a long time. To be on the safe side, Li Daochong first made 2 level 12 fire talismans to familiarize himself with the process. The stronger one's divine mind was, the stronger one's memory, learning ability, and control would be. Therefore, Li Daochong hadn't made talismans for a long time, but his level hadn't decreased at all. On the contrary, with the improvement of his cultivation, his talisman-making level had steadily improved. Coupled with the memory of his previous life and the uniqueness of the spiritual base programming, it had become extremely easy for him to make talismans in this world. The only difficulty was the materials. The 2 enhanced level 12 fire talismans were a step further than the enhanced version Li Daochong had made before. After making them, Li Daochong immediately began to mix the materials and prepare to make the super talisman. Li Daochong had very limited materials at hand. It was almost impossible to make talismans above level 15 with these materials. Li Daochong had made a level 17 talisman last time. However, the level 17 talisman could only deal with nether demons or low-level devil generals. It was not very useful to deal with mid-level devil generals like fiendish pythons. After level 15, the talisman's power would increase exponentially with each upgrade. A level 17 talisman was equivalent to a small nuclear bomb. Its destructive power was enough to raze a large cultivation city to the ground. A level 18 talisman was enough to change the topography and environment of a small cultivation planet and destroy everything within thousands of square kilometers. Going 1 level higher, a level 19 talisman could destroy a cultivation planet if it hit a vital point. A level 20 talisman was another watershed. At this level, the talisman's power would reach a terrifying level, comparable to a powerful nuclear bomb. It could blow a cultivation planet into slag in minutes. A level 20 talisman was the minimum requirement to deal with nether demons at the Devil King level. Li Daochong wanted to make a level 21 talisman this time. Level 20 talisman was not very safe. However, even if Li Daochong was talented in making talismans and had an innate advantage, he wouldn't be able to succeed easily. The possibility of success on the first try was not high. The materials on hand were limited, and there was almost no room for error. However, with the spiritual brain, Li Daochong could simulate first. In fact, with Li Daochong's current materials, it was impossible for him to craft a level 21 talisman. However, because he had the Demon King's demonic core and his own spirit blood, these 2 special items were enough to make up for the lack of materials. Li Daochong entered all the materials into his spiritual brain and then entered a high-intensity, high-frequency simulation process. For 3 days and 3 nights, Li Daochong had tried to simulate the process of talisman crafting hundreds of thousands of times, and the failure rate was as high as 80%. With such a high failure rate, it was naturally impossible to put it into practice. Li Daochong wasn't in a hurry. Under such harsh conditions, he didn't expect to be able to quickly complete the creation of a level 21 talisman. Days passed, After another 7 days and 7 nights of simulation experiments, Li Daochong finally raised the success rate to about 70% while consuming a lot of his telepathic thoughts. During this period, Li Daochong had gone through millions of simulation experiments, and the accuracy of his telekinesis had greatly improved during this process. On the 11th day, Li Daochong finally decided to put it into practice. The process of blending and mixing was relatively simple. The difficult part was how to skillfully mix in the Demon King's demonic core. The powder of the Demon King's demonic core contained powerful dead soul force and demonic chi, and couldn't be mixed with spirit herbs and spirit materials. Once they came into contact, they would dissolve each other. To put bluntly, they were two opposite substances. Fundamentally speaking, the powder separated from the Demon King's demonic core couldn't be used to make talismans. Li Daochong naturally understood this point. So from the beginning, Li Daochong didn't plan to make talismans in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a one-time offensive magic weapon similar to a talisman. Let's call it a magic weapon for the time being. Under normal circumstances, when dead soul force and spirit chi collided, there wouldn't be any destructive power, and they would only slowly dissolve each other. This process of melting wasn't annihilation, but assimilation. If dead soul force had the upper hand, spirit chi would be swallowed and transformed into dead soul force. When spirit chi had the upper hand, dead soul force would be swallowed and transformed into spirit chi. This transformation process wasn't exclusive to Li Daochong's hot-blooded upgrader. However, if highly condensed dead soul force and highly condensed spirit chi collided violently, it would be different. Because the melting process was too intense, the two opposite energies wouldn't give way to each other, and an explosion would occur. The higher the degree of condensation, the greater the energy carried by the two substances, and the greater the power of the explosion. The powder separated from the Demon King's demonic core wasn't as simple as dead soul force, but a powder condensed from a higher level of demonic chi. Corresponding to it should be the spirit blood of a body integration cultivator or the spiritualization of a primordial spirit gold body. The talisman Li Daochong made was divided into 2 parts. One part was engraved with the demonic core powder, and the other part was engraved with his own spirit blood. Then, a complete isolation spirit array was added, and the isolation belt in the middle was only a level 10 fire talisman spirit pattern. The small spirit pattern in the middle was the detonator, and once triggered, it would shatter the isolation spirit array. Once the isolation disappeared, the demonic chi and spirit chi would immediately collide violently, resulting in a terrifying destructive power. Li Daochong used his spirit brain to calculate the power of the explosion tens of thousands of times, and the final result was about the same as the power of a level 21 spirit talisman, or even slightly stronger. The process of making this special spirit talisman was very different from ordinary spirit talismans, but once the technique was mastered, the success rate was much higher than ordinary spirit talismans. Li Daochong's inspiration came from the annihilation of matter and antimatter in his previous life. Dead soul force and spirit chi belonged to the positive and negative energies. For the next 3 days, Li Daochong was extremely careful with every step, and he couldn't make the slightest mistake. If this special spirit talisman made a mistake, a disaster would erupt. There were 3 mistakes in the entire process, but fortunately, Li Daochong passed through them without any danger. After 5 days and 5 nights, Li Daochong finally finished making this special spirit talisman. The finished product was better than Li Daochong had expected. Whether it could cause damage to the Demon King's clone was unknown, but at least he had a trump card in his hand. Making this special spirit talisman took Li Daochong more than half a month. During this time, the Shabi, which had been searching for the 3 types of magic gold, returned twice, each time bringing back some magic gold. The second time, it brought back 3 kilograms of magic silver. Li Daochong learned that the Shabi had another ability besides eating ghosts, which was to find magic gold. Its sharp sense of smell didn't only target dark ghosts, but could also smell special magic gold. Li Daochong's confidence soared. Since the Shabi had this ability, All he had to do was wait patiently. Another half a month later, when Shabi returned, it brought back 6 different types of high-grade magic gold. However, it didn't have the other 2 types of magic gold required to make silver immortal soul. Li Daochong originally thought that magic silver would be very difficult to find, and there was even a high chance that it wouldn't be found. He didn't expect that the Shabi would find magic silver, but not the other 2 types of magic gold. However, with the core magic gold and magic silver, the other 2 types could be replaced with other magic gold. This time, Li Daochong didn't let the Shabi go out. The magic gold they had was enough. The spirit brain came in handy again. Li Daochong didn't know much about alchemy. The spirit brain had everything. When Li Daochong was at the Blue Bay Star, he had downloaded a lot of data from the spirit net. After half a month of research, Li Daochong finally made a magic gold mixture that could replace star soul crystals and mixed origin iron. Its effect was even better than star soul crystals and mixed origin iron. Li Daochong also added his own spirit blood. At the same time, the Shabi contributed 3 drops of its divine beast essence blood. However, this weakened the Shabi. Every drop of essence blood contained essence, but there was no better way. Although the Shabi's intelligence hadn't been fully developed, this young divine beast still understood what was more important. Li Daochong hadn't refined a spirit magnetic bullet before, so refining Silver Soul was very slow. Another half a month passed. Li Daochong finally made 5 Silver Souls. Strictly speaking, they weren't Silver Souls anymore. There was a big difference in their attributes. Li Daochong mixed in a lot of other magic gold, and when refining the spirit magnetic bullets, he added the power of Yang Lightning. These 5 spirit magnetic bullets were even more powerful than the silver immortal soul. Li Daochong renamed them Blood Souls. Everything was ready. Li Daochong once again adjusted his breathing. 3 days later, his body was back to its peak state. When Li Daochong opened his eyes, the blue gold light in his eyes crackled. The blood in his body quickly boiled. After nearly a year of hibernation, it was time to challenge the Demon King's clone. Li Daochong understood that he couldn't hide here forever. Black Jupiter had been discovered. The seal left by the immortals would be broken by the Hades sooner or later. If Li Daochong wanted to return alive, he could only rely on himself. No one could enter the depths of the Hades to save him. Even if they did, they would only be throwing their lives away. Li Daochong had separated dozens of weak strands of his divine sense to monitor the surroundings of his spirit sea. Every once in a while, he would enter the seal to check if it had been broken. Black Jupiter was still safe. The Hades hadn't broken the seal yet. In fact, half a year ago, Sakyamappa had sent a large number of underworld warlocks to break down the seal. But half a year later, the progress was very slow. Even though the seal left by the immortals had been baptized by the passage of 2,000 years and was much weaker than before, it was still an insurmountable barrier for the Hades. The Demon King's clone cooperated with the underworld warlocks outside, but almost all of the demonic energy formed by the clone came from the endless abyss. The death energy on Black Jupiter had been greatly weakened. The clone's energy consumption was irreversible. In other words, every bit of energy consumed would weaken the clone by a bit. Because of this, the Demon King's clone couldn't use his full strength and provided very little help. Otherwise, breaking through the seal from the inside would be much easier than breaking in from the outside. A year ago, the 2 demons had worked together to create a gap from the inside because it was easier to break through from the inside. The Demon King's clone was stronger than either of the 2 demons, but his demonic will couldn't compare. The 2 demons were the main body, and the Demon King's clone was only a strand of demonic will. In terms of soul power, the Demon King's clone couldn't use underworld arts as freely as the 2 demons. State Teacher, is it still not enough? Sakyamappa transmitted through his demonic will to the Demon King's clone, who was sitting on a peak at the edge of the endless mountain range. Your Highness, this subject doesn't have enough soul power to use the great underworld art. I can only rely on the small underworld art to drill in bit by bit. This seal is very strange. If I can't use the great underworld art, this is already the fastest I can go. The Demon King's clone transmitted. After a moment of silence, Sakyamapa's voice sounded again. You still haven't found Li Daochong? This kid's temperament is terrifyingly calm. He hasn't revealed anything in the past year, but it won't be long before a gap is drilled in the seal. As long as the underworld demon army enters, no matter where Li Daochong is hiding, he will be found. Thank you, State Teacher. This subject is the protector of the Netherworld clan. It is this subject's honor to help Your Highness. With Your Highness leading, the Netherworld clan will definitely be able to return to the glory of the Hades. Ha ha, good. Ben Huang will definitely not disappoint the clan. State Teacher, what did you find? Li Daochong has come out. Oh, Your Highness, this subject sensed Li Daochong's aura. That kid finally couldn't hold it in anymore. The fastest mobile version of the website. Chapter 719. Li Daochong emerged from the seabed of Sky Thunder Island. With a whoosh, the surface of the sea split open, and a ray of azure light shot into the sky. In the blink of an eye, Li Daochong had already appeared thousands of meters above the sea. Hiss! Li Daochong took a deep breath. Anyone would be suffocated after staying in a sealed space for a year. Li Daochong looked around at the vast world, and a knowing smile appeared on his face. The outside was still the most comfortable. Suddenly, he felt as if a lifetime had passed. The spiritual wind caressed his face, and it was indescribably refreshing. After indulging for a while, Li Daochong's eyes suddenly narrowed as he looked toward the endless mountain range. Whoosh! With a flash of light, Li Daochong flew over. On the other side, the Yama King's avatar also sensed that Li Daochong was no longer concealing his aura. Almost at the same time, the Yama King's avatar also rushed toward Li Daochong. The two most powerful auras on Blackwood Planet were rushing toward each other at their fastest speed. One righteous and one demonic, one human and one ghost. Neither held back. Blackwood Planet, a mysterious planet that had been silent for more than 2,000 years, seemed to have sensed danger at this moment. The entire planet trembled slightly. Li Daochong flew at a low altitude, less than 10 feet away from the surface of the sea. He was as fast as lightning, and wherever he passed, the surface of the sea would explode as if it were being sliced apart by a giant sword. The Yama King's avatar covered the entire sky with a boundless black aura, and it was like a burning fireball. In less than 10 minutes, the two terrifying forces that could destroy a cultivation planet met in a vast blue sea. Li Daochong and the Yama King's avatar stopped in their tracks, and both of them brought about powerful air currents. Boom! With a loud bang, the two air currents collided, and a giant whirlpool with a diameter of more than 10 kilometers appeared on the surface of the sea. The entire Spirit Sea was stirred up. The two sides stared at each other, and the sea below them churned and spun as they stared at each other. Bai Hui! Li Daochong's eyes flickered with bluish-gold light. Two blood-red flames burned in the hollow eyes of the Yama King's avatar, as if they could spurt out at any time and burn everything he saw. Li Daochong, after being a turtle for so long, you're finally willing to show yourself? The Yama King's avatar mocked. Bang! There was a muffled thunder. Li Daochong didn't say anything. He raised the silent annihilation in his hand and fired. Li Daochong was a good example of what it meant to be a social flat-top bro. He was a man of few words. Li Daochong knew that his strength was not as good as his opponent's, so he decided to strike first to gain the upper hand, and strike later to suffer calamity. The Yama King's avatar didn't expect Li Daochong to attack without warning. Moreover, it was an attack that he didn't know about. When the spirit energy gun shot out a round of blood-red light, the flames in the Yama King's avatar's eyes suddenly sprang up, and his dark eye sockets widened. What? The Yama King's avatar screamed in his heart. He actually felt an inexplicable sense of fear. Demon King Shield, the Yama King shouted, and a black prismatic shield instantly appeared in front of him. Boom! The blood-red light broke through the Demon King's shield without any resistance. The Yama King's avatar raised a circular protective shield around him, but it was still penetrated. Pucci! The blood soul pierced through the Yama King's shoulder, and sparks flickered on the penetrated part. You? The Yama King's avatar was incomparably shocked and angry. He had been careless for a moment. What made the Yama King's avatar even angrier was that he had been hit and injured. The Yama King's avatar's arrogant attitude instantly collapsed, and his demonic soul even showed a trace of weakness. The Yama King's avatar in Jiryo's nether star suddenly opened his eyes, and his face was full of shock. The nether race's imperial preceptor couldn't understand how Li Daocheng had obtained such a powerful spirit magnetic gun in just a year's time. The Yama King had experienced the battle between the Hades and the human realm. He knew very well that the most powerful spirit magnetic gun of the human cultivators could only kill demon generals. It was useless in front of a demon king. However, Li Daocheng's shot just now was terrifyingly powerful. If it weren't for the fact that he had so many trump cards and was cautious enough, this shot would have hit the demonic soul and directly killed the avatar. Damn it! The Yama King's avatar gritted his teeth and then quickly closed his eyes. The Yama King's avatar flashed and quickly distanced himself from Li Daocheng. He only stopped after retreating 1,000 meters. Looking at the hole in his shoulder, his lungs were about to explode. Li Daocheng, this king swears to take you down today, the Yama King's avatar roared. Li Daocheng acted as if he didn't hear it. He only looked coldly at the Yama King's avatar with a hint of pity in his eyes. The unexpected shot didn't achieve the expected effect. Li Daocheng originally wanted to cripple the other party with one shot. After using one blood soul bullet, there were still 4 left. Each of them was extremely precious. If Li Daocheng wanted to kill the Yama King's avatar in front of him, he could only rely on the Annihilation Talisman and the blood soul bullet. His own divine ability attack probably wouldn't have much effect. The Yama King's avatar stretched out his hand, and a vulture formed by black fog appeared on his arm. The Black Hell Vulture was a kind of nether beast formed by the demon origin of the Hades. Nether beasts were the products of the Hades, while ghost beasts were spiritual beasts that were tainted by the aura of death. There was a fundamental difference between the two. Nether beasts were much stronger than ghost beasts, and the Black Hell Vulture was a king-level demonic beast among nether beasts. Sky-devouring vulture wheel. The Yama King's avatar glared fiercely at Li Daocheng and growled. The Black Hell Vulture, standing on his arm, let out a terrifying cry and flew into the sky. Its wingspan was 10 meters long. Li Daocheng was slightly stunned. At first, he thought that the Black Hell Vulture was an illusion formed by thought. When the beast left the Yama King's avatar, he realized that it wasn't an illusion. It was real. Then Li Daocheng's face darkened. Needless to say, the Yama King's avatar used the great dark art, demonic word summoning. This dark art was recorded in the various ancient books of the human region. It was an extremely vicious move. The level and number of nether beasts summoned mainly depended on the strength of the caster. The Black Hell Vulture flew toward Li Daocheng, but the latter disappeared in a flash. The Black Hell Vulture missed. However, just as Li Daocheng appeared in the void hundreds of meters away, a Black Hell Vulture broke through the air and flew toward him. Li Daocheng's pupils shrank, and the Tsang ink flew out. Clang! The blade hit the Black Hell Vulture's wing with a crisp sound of metal colliding, but it didn't even cut off a hair. The third Dark Hell Vulture appeared behind Li Daocheng, its pair of giant claws clawing at Li Daocheng's back. Thousand sound escape. Ninefold fist. Li Daocheng executed 2 divine abilities consecutively and disappeared from the spot again. In an instant, he appeared behind the third Dark Abyss Vulture and punched towards its back. Bam, 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 boom! The fist with thunder power landed heavily on the Black Hell Vulture's broad back. With a muffled sound, the giant beast was smashed into the sea like a cannonball and exploded into huge waves. The waves splashed up hundreds of meters high. Ha! Li Daocheng's heart skipped a beat as a withered black hand patted his shoulder. Li Daocheng, have a taste of this king's soul-imprisoning demonic will. Die! The Yama King's avatar, who had successfully launched a sneak attack, roared. The withered black hand that patted Li Daocheng's shoulder flashed with black sparks. It carried demonic chi and demonic will as it madly poured into Li Daocheng's body. Chapter 720. Li Daocheng's face stiffened. The dark vulture released by the Demon King was only bait. He cursed inwardly. The Demon King's avatar revealed a sinister smile. Li Daocheng die. The Demon King's demonic thoughts poured into Li Daocheng's body like a tide, madly rushing into his inner world. Working hard to update. Please refresh later to visit the new 81st Chinese website. This chapter is working hard to update. Please refresh later to visit handsome man and beautiful woman. Please register as a member first. Register as a member of this site and use the bookmark function on the bookshelf. If this chapter is nonsense like the author asking for votes, please skip to the next chapter. Please save this page first so that you can read it later. Otherwise, you won't be able to find this chapter later. Recommended Great God Author. Strange Stories of the Southern Song Dynasty. Strange Stories of the Southern Song Dynasty Summary. He was just a small servant, but he was involved in an ancient secret. A bizarre murder case had sent an affectionate young miss and a cold and arrogant little maid to him. Were they really innocent people who were involved in this? Westlake Broken Bridge, strange and treacherous. Fate leads by a thread. The truth is just a few feet away. Strange Stories of the Southern Song Dynasty forwarding address /33XS/31755/31755/3/content trial reading chapter 001. Returning home in Glory Southern Dynasty, Qi Kingdom, Qiantang, Shieling Bridge. The moon hung high in the sky. Night fog curled up on the road. An oil wall carriage approached from afar, lightly speeding on a small road in the countryside of Jiangnan. A pair of lanterns hung in front of the carriage. As the carriage bumped along with the rolling wheels, the delicate and beautiful Sioux character on the lantern swayed. The carriage was draped with a light muslin curtain, and a coachman sat in front of the carriage holding the reins. The moonlight was like water, illuminating the ground and not dark. More importantly, he was already familiar with this road. He could walk on it with his eyes closed, so the night did not affect the speed of the carriage in the slightest. The curtain rose and fell with the wind, occasionally revealing three beautiful figures in the carriage. In the middle of the group was a young lady dressed in red. Her hair was cloudy and her steps were light. Looking from behind, one could only see her slender neck, like that of a graceful swan. The girl on the left had white hair and the girl on the right had green hair. Judging from her clothes and hairstyle, she was still dressed as a young girl. Obviously, she was the maid of the beauty in the middle. However, looking at the three of them sitting together, walking under the moonlight, and their crisp laughter spreading all the way, it was obvious that they were as close as sisters. The girl in the middle was Qiantang's #1 dancer, Su Yaoyao. The girls in white and green were her maids, Bai Su and Qing Ting. The three ladies were traveling at night to meet with young Master Wan, an official's family. Tonight, young Master Wan had set up a banquet and invited all the local talents and beauties. First, domain name. Please remember _3. All of a sudden, the frosty night changed from a cold white color to a golden glow. It was as if a sealed sun had suddenly broken free from its shackles and leaped into the sky. The coachman, Old Huang, who was driving the carriage, suddenly couldn't see anything. In a panic, he hurriedly pulled on the reins. The two horses were abruptly reined in by him and reared up. Their four big hooves heavily smashed onto the ground with a paw sound, abruptly stopping the carriage. Io! The three girls in the carriage were caught off guard and almost fell out of the carriage because of the sudden stop. Fortunately, the three of them were squeezed together. Although the three girls' delicate bodies were light, how wide could an oil wall carriage be? Therefore, they didn't roll out of the carriage. If they fell and messed up their hair, it would be fine, but if they fell and hit the ground with their faces, it would ruin their beautiful face that made people feel pity for them. Old Huang, what's going on? Su Yaoyao was a little angry. She covered her face with her hand and blocked the strong light. She immediately lifted the curtain, bent over, and stood on the carriage. Bai Su and Qingting followed. The three of them stood at the front of the carriage and looked up at the sky. As soon as they saw the strange scene in the sky, they were stunned. He saw a huge golden wheel-like object that looked like a heavenly king was hovering in the air. The light that was as bright as the sun was radiating from it. It swayed in the air as if it couldn't support itself. All of a sudden, the golden wheel-like object exploded. The huge shock wave was like ripples that quickly spread in all directions. The driver, Old Huang, cried out in surprise. He rolled off the carriage like a lazy donkey and dove into the bottom of the carriage. However, Su Yaoyao, Bai Su, and Qingting couldn't avoid it in time. The golden light passed through their bodies. The three beautiful girls swayed and fell to the ground. The golden light disappeared, and so did the golden wheel in the sky. A few places were set on fire, and smoke rose. The night returned to its cold state as it quietly shone on the three beautiful bodies. New Year's Eve Chinese network, the night, dew was sparkling and translucent. The grass was like a carpet, the pine trees were like a canopy, and the path was silent. The oil wall carriage stopped there, and the two horses snorted blankly as if nothing had happened. Time flew by. 500 years later. The moon was high in the sky, and the lanterns were lit. It was a lively time in Qinhuai. Beside the peach leaf fairy, a young man waved a small fan and slowly walked over. Many passers-by on the road would greet him warmly, Brother Han. The young man would return their greetings with a smile and was very polite. Brother Han was dressed in a round-necked robe with a leather belt around his waist. He wore a legless headdress, and there was a beautiful rose in his hair. It complemented his handsome face and made him look a little devilish. However, there was nothing he could do. This was the custom of the Song dynasty. From the emperor to the commoners, as long as they were men, they liked to wear flowers. The flower-wearing young man in front of him was tall and handsome. Even when he wasn't smiling, there was a slight smile on his lips. It was slightly upturned and very likable. His pair of black and shiny eyebrows made his eyes look especially spirited and lively. It was as if he could speak as he looked around. He was different from those men who were covered in grease and insisted on wearing flowers. When young ladies and young wives saw him, they couldn't help but take a few more glances. This person was called Yang Han. 3 days ago, he was still a member of the Nanjing Street Department in the Song dynasty. The street department was in charge of the city streets. Its functions and status were similar to the urban management of the later generations. However, the urban management of the Song dynasty had many functions. It was almost a combination of policing, environmental protection, taxation, fire control, price inspection, industrial and commercial law enforcement, greening and cleaning, and handling illegal road occupation. Those who could do this were either scoundrels like Nioer, who could control people, or slick in dealing with people, who knew how to steer according to the wind, and who was alert and clever. But when he really had to fight with people, he had to be a good fighter. Not only could he bend and stretch, but he also had to be soft and hard. Yang Han belonged to the latter. He had the gift of the gab, was alert, and had good martial arts. Although he was a small person at the bottom of society, in the 300 years of the Song dynasty, the commoners lived the best and wealthiest lives. If you didn't have the ambition to become a marquis and conquer the world, you just wanted to be a commoner. Or if you only had the ability to be a commoner, then you were born in the Song dynasty and had cultivated merit for several generations. In other dynasties, the lives of commoners were far inferior. Therefore, Yang Han, a small urban management of the Song dynasty's Jiankong city, lived a very interesting life. Unfortunately, 3 days ago, he lost his fat job. It wasn't that Yang Han was impartial and offended a big shot. It wasn't that he met a scoundrel with a background and couldn't continue working. It was because the head of the street department, Master Li, had taken a fancy to him and wanted to marry his daughter to him. The head of the department was equivalent to the captain of the urban management team. He was a member of the Yamen, and people like Yang Han were all recruited by the head of the department. Therefore, to be precise, Yang Han was the head of the department. To be able to become the son-in-law of the head of the department, it should be a blessing from his ancestors' graves. However, Yang Han was also a smooth and slick character. He was very familiar with the city's fox and rat society in Jinkong City. His eyes and ears were very well informed. He knew the head of the department's precious daughter better than the head of the department himself. How could he agree? Master Li's daughter was called Li Xiao. She was born beautiful, but she wasn't very restrained in the imperial examination. According to the news that Yang Han heard, this Miss Li had several lovers. She even had an abortion for one of her recent lovers, a scholar named Mu Si. Until now, the two of them were still hooking up with each other, and their relationship was unclear. As the saying goes, it's better to marry a prostitute and live a good life than marry a red apricot over the wall. Yang Han was also an ambitious man. He didn't want to be a scrubbing pot for that surnamed Mu. Being pointed at behind his back would make him a laughingstock. Therefore, Yang Han used all his skills and didn't hesitate to sully himself. He refused to submit no matter what. However, this Master Li didn't know what was wrong with his brain. He didn't understand the principle that a forcefully twisted melon wouldn't be sweet. He actually threatened to resign from his job. Yang Han naturally refused to submit, so he lost his job. These 2 days, when the people on the street mentioned the missing Yang Han, many people couldn't help but sigh. They felt sorry for him, but they didn't expect that he would show up this evening. There was a restaurant beside Tao. Yang Han walked in, picked a table, and sat down. He raised his voice and said, "Shopkeeper, a bowl of duck blood and vermicelli soup, a tray of crab roe buns, and a jiao of wine." When Miss Du, who was wearing an apron, saw that it was Yang Han, she was delighted. Girls love pretty boys. Who didn't love to see a handsome young man? She and her father took care of this restaurant. Every time Yang Han came, the duck blood and vermicelli soup would be full of ingredients. They were even willing to add a spoonful of pepper for him. She immediately agreed crisply and busied herself. Yang Han turned his head and saw Old Fan passing by with a pole. He hurriedly shouted, "Hey, Old Fan, come in, come in. Cut me half a tail of mutton and a set of pig pancreas." Old Fan was a person who carried a pole and sold cooked food. Yang Han was familiar with him. When he heard him call, he hurriedly mustered up his courage and entered the restaurant. He put down the pole and the chopping board on Yang Han's table. He picked up a piece of mutton and began to cut it. As he cut, he smiled and said, "Brother Han, you're looking for a better job. Where are you getting rich now?" Yang Han had been waiting for him to say this. He glanced around arrogantly, and when he saw that everyone had pricked up their ears, he smiled reservedly. "Not really, not really. It's just that I'm indebted to the magistrate of Peace Manor, Lord Li, for his appreciation. Now, I'm a small steward in the Li estate." Old Fan was shocked. He exclaimed, "Io, that's amazing. A 7th-ranked official in front of the Prime Minister's door. Brother Han, now that you're a steward in Master Li's estate, I'm afraid your status isn't lower than Master Li's, right?" Yang Han smiled faintly. It wasn't good for him to flatter himself, but he didn't deny it either. It was clear that he tacitly agreed with Old Fan's words. Originally, why else would he be dressed like a flower with a hairpin and a sachet tied to his waist? Why else would he appear in the area he was previously in charge of, returning home in silken robes? Southern Song Chronicles 2/3/XS/317/5/3/317/3175553/. Chapter 721. Sakyamappa had been watching the battle through King Yinluo's demonic consciousness since the beginning. Both King Yinluo and Sakyamappa thought that this was a battle without any suspense. Li Daochong would be easily taken down by King Yinluo's clone. However, the course of the battle was far beyond the two Netherworld race bigwigs' expectations. Sakyamappa could see that something was amiss, but how could King Yinluo's original body not see it? The two demons were killed, and the two received news that the spiritual energy laws on Blackwood Star had recovered. Li Daochong had taken advantage of the Nine Heavens' primordial lightning attack by the two demons. However, Li Daocheng's combat strength seemed to indicate that the two demons had been killed, not taken advantage of. Your Highness, we can't let this kid live. His growth is too fast, so fast that it's unbelievable. King Yinluo's expression was extremely gloomy, and his original body's face was twitching nonstop. While the two Netherworld bigwigs were talking, Li Daocheng had already eliminated more than 100 Black Hell Vultures. Li Daocheng crushed the last Black Hell Vulture's neck with one hand, and then it exploded into a rain of black blood that dissipated into the void. Li Daocheng then turned to look at King Yinluo's clone. He held the Song Ink and activated the 1,000-sound escape technique, charging straight at him. Li Daocheng seemed to have killed more than 100 Black Hell Vultures with ease, but in reality, it was built on a large consumption of energy regardless of the cost. Li Daocheng didn't hold back at all from the start. His intention was clear, and he wanted to end the battle quickly. The contempt in King Yinluo's clone's eyes disappeared, and it was replaced by a deep sense of fear. A demon King Hades was actually afraid of an early-stage void refinement cultivator. This greatly violated the laws of common sense. King Yinluo's clone had just been hit by Li Daocheng's divine consciousness attack, and then was struck by the Yang lightning, so his arrogance was greatly reduced. Seeing Li Daocheng charging at him, he didn't dare to underestimate him anymore. He raised his hands and drew a strange pattern. Then, he shouted and slapped his palms on the pattern. Devil Flame, Devil Dragon Wave. Imperial Advisor, you mustn't. Sakyamappa, try to stop him. He didn't expect the Yama King to use such a move. The Devil Flame and Devil Dragon Wave was the Yama King's ultimate skill, and he was the only one in the entire Netherworld race who could use it. This move was considered a top-notch technique in the Great Hades art. It could summon the ghostly dragons in the Hades original star field. Because Yama King was only using his avatar, the power of this move was greatly reduced. Coupled with the fact that the doppelganger had just suffered from Li Daocheng's heavy blow, the doppelganger's combat power was once again weakened. Therefore, he could only summon ghost dragons. The ultimate summon of the Devil Flame and Devil Dragon Wave could drive the great Devil Dragon Emperor on the Devil World Star in the Hades. It was a supreme demonic beast that could threaten cultivators in the Tribulation Transcendent stage. It was on par with the divine beasts of the spiritual realm. However, even if it was just a ghost dragon, it still couldn't be underestimated. No matter where it was, dragons were synonymous with power. A dragon-shaped phantom formed by black flames shot out with a roar. Li Daocheng's pupils twitched, but he wasn't afraid at all. He was already prepared. Song Ink slashed horizontally. The first sword of the Great Void stage. Life and death were on the line. Whoosh! Song Ink shone brightly, and the void seemed to be about to be split open. Even the space was trembling. The blade light expanded to thousands of feet like lightning, shooting out like a huge crescent moon. The crescent-shaped blade light collided with the black flame ghost dragon. In an instant, the mountains collapsed and the earth cracked. Heaven and earth seemed to be about to explode. The dazzling light covered everything. There was nothing in sight. At that moment, only a vast expanse of whiteness was left. The Yama King's avatar was snot dripping from his nose. The great Hades art that he was best at was broken by an early-stage void refinement cultivator. The power of Li Daocheng's sword was not something that a void refinement cultivator could release. Even an early-stage combination cultivator might not be able to do this. Imperial Preceptor, can you capture this kid alive? Sakyamappa asked with a shocked expression. Your Highness, I'll do my best. The Yama King's confidence was obviously a lot weaker. Li Daocheng did not stop after slashing with his sword. Then, he slashed with his sword again. The second sword of the Great Void technique. The two swords completely annihilated the black flame ghost dragon. Li Daocheng had consumed a lot of energy, but he didn't dare to stop at all. He continued to charge forward, and his divine will enveloped the Yama King's avatar like a tide. Song Ink shot out like a bolt of lightning, and cold chi filled the air. The Yama King's avatar naturally didn't stay idle. His demonic will condensed into two demonic chi blades, and shot out of Tsang Ink to collide with it. Tsang Ink was naturally a feint. Li Daochong didn't expect to kill the Yama King's avatar with his saber. Bam! Li Daochong suddenly flashed to the side of the Yama King's avatar. He swung his spear, and a blood-red light whistled out. The Yama King's avatar was shocked. What? There's more? Hades had always known that the cultivation techniques of human cultivators were powerful. But at the same time, he also knew that the spiritual magnetic weapons and spiritual weapons produced with high-end cultivation techniques couldn't be mass-produced. The more high-end the spiritual magnetic bullets were, the rarer they were. It would take several years to produce the best spiritual magnetic bullets. When Li Daochong came up and fired a shot, the Yama King thought that there was only one spiritual magnetic bullet with such terrifying power. Who would have thought that there was more? The Yama King's avatar shouted, "Your Highness, save me!" Sakyamappa was already prepared. The demonic chi in his body surged. With a shout, he used all his demonic chi to perform a king-level meditation technique. The Void Wheel. A king-level underworld treasure was sent to the Yama King's avatar. The Yama King's avatar was formed by the Yama King's avatar, sent to the Blackwood Star by condensing all the remaining death energy in the Endless Abyss. Therefore, the Yama King's avatar didn't have any underworld treasures on him. The Demon King's shield that he released earlier was also formed by highly condensed demonic chi. A black Ink King's flag appeared in the Yama King's avatar's hand. In Demon Shield, the Yama King's avatar shouted. A black light shield appeared in front of him. With a boom, the blood soul shot onto the Een Demon shield, shattering it into pieces. The blood soul bullet also dissipated. Li Daochong was stunned for a moment. Looking at the flag in the Yama King's avatar's hand, he glanced at the sky. Just now, Li Daochong felt a terrifying aura pierce through the void and then disappear. That aura belonged to Li Daochong and Sakyamappa. Sakyamappa, who was far away on the Yama planet, was weak at this time. Even he couldn't bear using a king-level meditation technique. The consumption of the Void Wheel was too great. Li Daochong's eyes narrowed. Without any hesitation, he gathered a large amount of spirit chi in his hand and pulled the trigger. Bang! Another shot was fired. The Yama King's avatar didn't have time to curse. With a shocked expression, he waved the Een King's flag in his hand again. Ghost King 10,000 Skulls Forbidden Art. The Een King's flag was full of death chi. Terrifying cries and howls came from the flag, as if it came from hell. The entire void suddenly darkened. There was no light at all. It was like an abyss of Hades. Tens of thousands of ghost skulls rushed out crazily. Heaven and earth seemed to have been transferred to hell. Li Daochong pulled the trigger again. Bang! Another shot was fired. 2 blood souls were shot out one after another. Tens of thousands of skulls lined up in a row. The silver light penetrated them one by one. The Yama King's avatar didn't expect Li Daochong to shoot twice in a row. How many of these bullets does he have? The first blood soul pierced through more than half of the skulls flying out. The second followed the first trajectory and shot toward the Yama King's avatar. In a hurry, the Yama King's avatar raised the Een King's flag to block. Clang! With a crisp sound, the blood soul hit the flagpole of the Een King's flag. Crack! The flagpole broke. What? The Yama King's avatar exclaimed. The blood soul that broke the flagpole shot into the avatar's chest. Chapter 722. The blood soul bullet carried lightning power and demon silver and entered the body of King Yama's clone. After using the great dark art multiple times and being hit by Li Daochong's divine will, King Yama's clone was already in a weakened state. After being hit by the blood soul bullet again, King Yama's clone let out a roar. The demon silver and lightning power were extremely harmful to the netherworld, and the death aura was quickly corroded. Damn it, Sakyamappa cursed. He wanted to tear open the void and immediately go to Black Jupiter to capture Li Daochong. But he didn't have that ability. Moreover, using the void will just now almost made him collapse. He had paid such a high price, but it was useless. This prince of Jiuyo Hades was about to explode from anger. The Yama King banner was also destroyed by the spear. Anger burned in Sakyamapa's body. Li Daochong, Ben Huang won't stop until I destroy your bones and tendons and imprison your essence soul. Sakyamapa looked at the scene of King Yama's clone being hit with a ferocious expression. Then he suddenly opened his eyes and walked toward the forbidden area of the Netherworld race with a cold snort. He wanted to enter the blood demon pool in the forbidden area to recover his consumed demonic power. On Black Jupiter, King Yama's clone gradually became transparent and no longer had a physical form. The death aura suddenly decreased. King Yama wasn't willing to let his clone be killed just like that. Before dissipating, he condensed the last demon soul. Yama's soul shattering. With a roar, the clone turned into a huge demon hand and grabbed at Li Daochong. Although the clone didn't have much death aura left, the last attack before dissipating was still powerful. It was enough to kill a body integration stage cultivator. Li Daochong naturally didn't dare to fight head-on. Although he didn't want to give up the Annihilation Talisman, he couldn't care too much at this juncture. Even if Li Daochong could resist this attack with his own strength, he would definitely be injured. Killing the Demon King's clone was only the first step on Li Daochong's journey back. He couldn't afford to lose himself. Once he was injured, it would delay a lot of time. Now that the outer seal of Black Tree Star had been broken, Li Daochong no longer had a chance. Li Daochong didn't hesitate. He threw out the Annihilation Talisman while he activated the 1,000 Sonic Escape and flew away. Boom! With a deafening boom, the giant demonic hand formed by the doppelganger collided with the Annihilation Talisman in the void. The two forces that could destroy the heavens and the earth exploded upon impact. The spirit sea thousands of kilometers below instantly evaporated, and the shockwave from the explosion quickly spread. Li Daochong, who had flown hundreds of kilometers in the blink of an eye, was still unable to avoid the explosion. Li Daochong ran as fast as he could. Behind him was a cloud of explosions. If this kind of terrifying destructive power had happened on the Blue Bay Star, the Blue Bay Star would have already been destroyed. The explosion wasn't just horizontal. Everything within the radius of a sphere was affected. The clouds above were washed away, and the shock wave only stopped when it hit the gelatinous seal. The seal within the range of the shock wave was cut in half. The area where Li Daochong and Yama's doppelganger fought was at least 5,000 kilometers away from the Skyen mountain range. But the shock wave from the explosion still showed no signs of weakening when it reached the Skyen mountain range. The vast Skyen mountain range was already riddled with holes in the previous battle. At this moment, it was once again hit by a terrifying shock wave. For 2,000 years, the mortals of Black Tree Star had regarded the Skyen mountain range as a land of death. But now, half of it had been razed to the ground. A quarter of Black Tree Star was affected by the explosion. The terrain had completely changed. The ground had sunk dozens of meters. If not for the immortal seal and Black Tree Star's large size, this planet would have already been torn apart. A third of the spirit's sea had evaporated, and the sea level had dropped by more than 100 meters. In order to escape the explosion range, Li Daochong used all his strength to fly away, activating the 1,000 Sonic Escape at full force. After killing the Demon King's doppelganger, Li Daochong had also used up a lot of his spirit chi. He didn't have much spirit chi to continue using the 1,000 Sonic Escape. But as the Demon King's doppelganger completely dissipated, Li Daochong killed the Demon King's demonic soul. Beep! Demon King's demonic soul has been killed. Soul power obtained. Converted into spirit chi. The prompt from the Blood Spirit Level Up device in Li Daochong's Sea of Consciousness came as expected. The spirit chi obtained from killing the Demon King's demonic soul was very impressive. If he absorbed it completely, it would be enough for Li Daochong to level up again. But because of excessive exhaustion, Li Daochong used all the spirit chi he obtained to recover his physical strength. Li Daochong replenished the spirit chi he had lost. This gave him the capital to use the 1,000 Sonic Escape at full force. Otherwise, he would have been drowned by the shock wave. When everything calmed down, Li Daochong floated in the void and turned around to look at the mess behind him. He, who had never revealed his emotions, couldn't hide his emotions at this moment. A crater had been created in the spirit's sea, and the seabed, which was thousands of kilometers deep, was exposed. At this time, the sea that had not been affected poured down in torrents and madly poured into the missing sea pit. Li Daocheng's next plan was to return to the mine in the endless abyss and see if the sealed space crack could still be opened. If it was possible, it would naturally be the best way to go back. Otherwise, he would have to cross the vast universe of the Hades to return to the human territory. In this way, the risk would be greatly increased. Whether he could return alive would be a question mark. Li Daocheng looked at the collapsing spirit sea below and glanced in the direction of the endless mountain range. He summoned Song Ink and stood on the blade in a flash. There was a swoosh. Li Daocheng stepped on Song Ink and flew into the air. Flying on the blade could save a lot of spirit chi, and the speed was much faster than flying on his own. There was no need to use the 1,000 sonic escape. Just over an hour later, Li Daocheng arrived at the mine where the space crack was located. Time was tight. After Li Daocheng landed, his divine thoughts spread out wildly and covered an area of dozens of kilometers. An hour passed. 2 hours passed. When the third hour passed, Li Daocheng showed a wry smile on his face and immediately withdrew all his divine thought. There was no fluctuation in the space here. It was as if the space crack had never existed. The space crack had been completely sealed. This path was blocked, which was not good news for Li Daocheng. This meant that he had to rely on his own strength to fly back. However, Li Daocheng had a space shuttle in his storage ring. However, the energy reserve was somewhat insufficient. The original spirit stones in the space shuttle, together with the remaining spirit stones Li Daocheng had, would not be able to fly far. In addition to the energy, there was another difficulty. Li Daocheng did not know where the black Jupiter star was. He also did not know which direction to go after leaving the black Jupiter star. Li Daocheng flew out of the mine. He looked at the sky and fell into a daze. Master, if you can concentrate all the lightning in the thunderclouds above the sky Thunder Island at one point, you might be able to break through the void and open up a gap. Just as Li Daocheng was at his wit's end, Xuanyi's voice sounded in his mind. Li Daocheng's eyes flickered, but they soon dimmed again. The thunderclouds are very powerful. I am not afraid of the lightning and the thunderclouds, but it is easier said than done to concentrate all the lightning in one place. I can't do it with my current strength. There was a short silence. Master, you can set up a spirit array. Spirit array? I know very little about spirit arrays. Master, I know a spirit array that can gather lightning. Really? Li Daocheng's eyes lit up. The confusion from before dissipated. Master, I am from the fairy race. The fairy race's reproduction is different from all the other races. All the races in the spirit realm reproduce through their own fusion. Only the fairy race does not. The fairy race is formed through the convergence of the spirit chi of heaven and earth. Li Daocheng listened in silence and nodded slightly. Shui and I continued. Therefore, every elf is born with a spirit-gathering array. This array is formed by the luck of heaven and earth, but it is the strongest spirit-gathering array that follows the law of spiritual energy. Therefore, every elf has their own spirit-gathering array. Otherwise, they would not exist anymore. After listening to Xuanyi's explanation, Li Daocheng's heart rekindled with hope. He then flew toward Sky Thunder Island. 2 hours later, Li Daocheng appeared outside Sky Thunder Island. Looking at the rolling thunderclouds in the sky, it was as if he saw the door to leaving the Hades. Master, I am a spirit-gathering array. Unfortunately, my cultivation is too low to gather such a large amount of lightning. Otherwise, there would be no need to set up a spirit array. I can just attract lightning. Even if you can attract lightning, there is no need to take the risk. It is better to be safe. Tell me how you want to set it up. Inyang, for symbols, 8 trigrams, 16 palaces. Shui and I told Li Daocheng the essentials of the spirit array's location without reservation. The more he listened, the more surprised he was. Wasn't this the book of changes from his previous life? Although there were some differences, it was still the same. Li Daocheng quickly grasped the essentials of setting up a spirit array. He just needed to find the spirit eye according to the specific location. To put it bluntly, it was to make the spirit chi law controllable. However, after the array was set up, it could only attract lightning to one point. It could not be gathered. In other words, after the spirit gathering array was set up, the lightning from the thunderclouds would only fall on one point and would not strike in all directions. This was not a problem for Li Daocheng because making talismans was his specialty. The lightning gathering talisman was not a high-level talisman. The only difficult part was the talisman paper. The lightning gathering talisman was not like other talismans that required many precious materials to make. This talisman did not require any materials. The level of the talisman paper and the runes engraved on it depended on the talisman paper. Li Daocheng could now easily engrave high-level runes. If he could make a level 21 talisman, engraving a level 20 talisman was naturally not a problem. How to make a special talisman paper was the biggest obstacle. Fortunately, with the Shabi, it was not difficult to find the materials. In just a few days, the Shabi had found all the materials Li Daocheng needed to make the talisman paper. Moreover, it was pleasantly surprised that it found a piece of thunder attracting wood. With the materials, an exquisite talisman paper was made in less than an hour. In these few days, Li Daocheng was not idle. The spirit gathering array had been set up. The lightning falling from the thunderclouds seemed to be controlled by someone, and all of it struck the center of the array. Li Daocheng spent a lot of time engraving the runes. Naturally, it was to avoid making mistakes. After another 3 days, a lightning gathering talisman was completed. Li Daocheng placed the lightning gathering talisman in the center of the array. Boom, boom, accompanied by the dense sound of thunder. The heavenly lightning continuously struck the lightning gathering talisman in the center of the array. The lightning gathering talisman absorbed all the lightning energy from each strike without missing a single bit. Chapter 723. The lightning gathering talisman was like a sponge, absorbing every bolt of heavenly lightning as if it was water, not leaving out a single bit. The lightning energy continued to gather in the lightning gathering talisman. Li Daocheng stood outside the spirit gathering array, watching the lightning energy gathering in the lightning gathering talisman. His eyes flickered slightly. He seemed to see the way home. This time, he had been back for far too long, and it was in the Hades. A day and a night passed just like that, and the heavenly lightning and the thunderclouds never stopped. Li Daocheng quietly waited for the lightning gathering talisman to complete. Li Daocheng didn't know how much power was needed to break through space, but it was definitely an unimaginable amount of energy. Li Daocheng had an extremely sharp perception of space under Chu Qinyue's training. Even the slightest fluctuation in space couldn't escape his perception. Boom! Dozens of lightning bolts gathered together and struck the spirit gathering array. The lightning gathering talisman flashed brightly, and the lightning energy inside was compressed in the runes, ready to move. Li Daocheng sat cross-legged in the air above the spirit gathering array. While waiting patiently, his divine sense covered an area of several thousand kilometers. If there was any movement within this range, he would immediately notice it. The 2 demons were killed, and the Demon King's avatar had dissipated. There was nothing suspicious on Black Tree Star that could threaten Li Daocheng. However, he still felt uneasy. As long as he didn't leave this place, he couldn't relax. Another day and night passed, and the lightning gathering talisman was still not full. The lightning gathering talisman that Li Daocheng engraved contained powerful spirit energy laws. The lightning gathering talisman was only the size of 2 palms, but it was engraved with 81 extremely complicated rune circuits, each of which branched into 108 lines. All the complicated runes were presented on a single piece of talisman paper, and none of them overlapped. If the big shots of the Human Realms Spirit Sequence Master Association saw these rune circuits, they would be impressed by the intricate patterns. This required a lot of precise calculations and a lot of computational power from the spiritual base programming. One might not be able to calculate the direction of a single rune even after millions of calculations. The slightest mistake would cause the entire lightning gathering rune to be completely destroyed. However, there was not a single flaw in the spirit rune on this talisman paper. Li Daochong had mastered telepathic thoughts, spirit energy, and spirit-based programming to the extreme. It was a level 22 lightning gathering talisman. In the entire human realm, there were less than 10 spirit sequence masters who could reach this level. Furthermore, every single one of them was a 3-star superstar spirit sequencer or above. With this innate advantage, Li Daochong could look down on all the heroes in the human domain spirit world. Talismans had always played an important role in the battle against the Hades. The third day passed. All the spiritual patterns on the Thunder Gathering Talisman finally lit up. Extracting the Thunder Gathering Talisman from the eye of the formation was also a technical job. Fortunately, Li Daochong was born with a strong resistance to lightning. It could ignore the heavenly lightning for a short period of time and absorb a certain amount of heavenly lightning to transform into its own heavenly lightning. However, he couldn't immerse himself in the heavenly lightning for too long. Otherwise, he would be injured by the lightning. If it were anyone else, extracting the talisman would be a risk of life and death. Li Daochong was simple and crude. He directly entered the eye of the formation and used his body to resist the lightning for a few seconds. Then, he took out the Thunder Gathering Talisman and retreated. The Spirit Gathering Array didn't care about it and left it to its own devices. However, the moment the Thunder Gathering Talisman was taken out, the area where the eye of the formation was located was immediately blasted by the terrifying heavenly lightning. This pit kept sinking under the bombardment of heavenly lightning. It was bottomless. Li Daochong held the Thunder Gathering Talisman with excitement in his eyes. This Thunder Gathering Talisman was enough to blast a great demon king to smithereens. The heavenly lightning gathered for 3 days and 3 nights was much more powerful than the 9 heavens primordial lightning. Li Daochong once again came to the mining pit at the edge of the endless abyss. This was the weakest space on Blackwood Planet. Although the spatial crack was sealed by the Demon King's clone, the space itself wasn't very stable. Therefore, releasing heavenly lightning here was the best choice. Li Daochong's divine sense constantly explored the space in this area. He wanted to choose the best node. Not only did this node have to be weak, it also had to be a place where no one was on the other side. This was because when the space was blasted open, the hole on the other side would release a large amount of energy. Blue Bay Star, a mere 4th-class planet, couldn't withstand such a large amount of energy. If he wasn't careful, the entire Blue Bay Star would be blasted open. However, Li Daochong couldn't choose the specific location on the other side of the space. Now, everything was ready except for the east wind. Li Daochong had to find a node on the other side. At this time, Chu Qinyue's hellish training played a key role. Li Daochong naturally didn't have the ability to blast open the space. However, his divine sense's keen perception could penetrate the unstable space and perceive the situation on the other side. Although it was still not very accurate, it was much better than not being able to perceive anything at all. However, space was a very mysterious thing. The slightest deviation could lead to a huge difference. Simply put, it was similar to finding a location on a map. It might look very close on the map, but it was actually tens or even hundreds of kilometers away. This depended on how big the area covered by the map was. The entire human domain spirit world was several times smaller than before, but it was still shockingly large. Li Daochong couldn't be precise, but he also couldn't place the space he blasted open on Blue Bay Star. Li Daochong could only choose to adjust the location of a node. If he didn't make any adjustments, the other side of the space he blasted open would be the underground area of Blue Bay Star's Heavenly Palace Club. If he blasted open the space there, the powerful impact of the energy would be enough to destroy Blue Bay Star. Master, what about the mortals on Blackwood Star? Just as Li Daocheng was ready, Xuanyi's worried voice sounded in his sea of consciousness. There's no time to worry about that. Blackwood Star has been here for more than 2,000 years, and its population has dropped drastically. However, Blackwood Star is just too big. The number of mortals scattered around is still a huge number. It's unrealistic to want to take them all away, Li Daocheng said honestly. Xuanyi's worries weren't unfounded. It was only a matter of time before the seal around Blackwood Star was broken. Once it was broken, it wouldn't be long before Blackwood Star was completely transformed into a dead star. All the mortals here would become food for the dark ghosts. However, Li Daocheng truly didn't have the ability to save so many people. He had to expend a lot of effort to barely make it possible to leave Blackwood Star. The crack in space couldn't be maintained for long. It would close on its own in a few seconds. Whether it was the law of spiritual qi or the law of death, they were all based on the law of space. Without space, there was nothing to talk about. However, Xuanyi said, Master, Xuanyi has been sensing a very weak signal for the past few days. It's the telekinesis signal unique to the elves. However, because the signal is too weak, Xuanyi can't tell what the telekinesis signal is trying to convey. However, the direction of the signal is very clear. If possible, can you delay for a while and go to the place where the signal is coming from? Li Daocheng didn't hesitate for long before saying, Let's go and take a look. Xuanyi was delighted. Thank you, Master. It won't take too long. Where is it? Li Daocheng asked. Below the endless abyss. Xuanyi replied immediately. Li Daocheng's brows twitched slightly. He was a little surprised, but he didn't ask any more questions. He immediately took out Song ink and wrote it toward the depths of the endless abyss. Chapter 724. The depth of the bottomless abyss was much deeper than Li Daocheng had expected. After falling for hundreds of kilometers, he still hadn't reached the bottom. The further down he went, the thinner the spirit qi became, and the thicker the remaining death qi became. However, because the Demon King's clone had absorbed the death qi, it wasn't as viscous anymore. To be precise, the remaining death qi was more like yin qi. This yin qi prevented Xuanyi from accurately receiving the spirit signal. When Li Daocheng still hadn't reached the bottom after falling for thousands of kilometers, a strange expression appeared on his face. Could this bottomless abyss lead all the way to the core of Blackwood Star? Li Daocheng didn't fall very quickly. How deep did he think a pit could be? At most 1,000 kilometers. Considering the breadth of Blackwood Star, a 1,000-kilometer pit was already heaven-defying. However, after falling for more than 5,000 kilometers, he still hadn't reached the bottom. Moreover, the qi here had become very strange. It wasn't spirit qi or death qi, and the layer of yin qi was gradually disappearing. Li Daocheng originally only wanted to satisfy Xuanyi's wish and didn't think too much about entering the bottomless abyss. However, as he still couldn't reach the bottom, Li Daocheng became a little curious about what was down there. Li Daocheng suddenly increased his speed. His divine sense probed the bottom, and he directly used the 1,000-sound escape. Could it be that this bottomless abyss leads to the bottom of Blackwood Star's core? Li Daocheng thought to himself as he released his divine sense and probed the depths of the abyss. Li Daocheng had been to Blackwood Star's core once through the Ghost Manor, and the scene was unforgettable for Li Daocheng. A single sword strike had split such a huge cultivation planet in half and reached the core of the planet. In the end, the sword qi had condensed into a spirit qi ball to resist the death qi. Such amazing skills were simply unimaginable. It wasn't difficult to split a planet in half. The current Li Daocheng could also do it. Any void refinement realm cultivator could do it, let alone a demon king. However, it was easy to destroy, but difficult to control. It was even harder to destroy with control. The sword strike that split Blackwood Star and created the Spirit Sea was simply earth-shattering and mysterious. This was something that the current Li Daocheng could never hope to achieve. Creating a spirit sea was already shocking enough. Could it be that the endless abyss was also created? Li Daochong was puzzled as he fell faster and faster. According to the data left behind the last time he entered the planet's core, the radius of Black Jupiter was about 100,000 kilometers. This was an extremely terrifying number. However, after Li Daochong executed the 1,000 sonic escape, this kind of distance did not count as much. The deeper he went, the more Li Daochong felt that the name Endless Abyss was very appropriate. Logically speaking, it wouldn't take long for Li Daochong to cover a distance of more than 100,000 kilometers if he activated his maximum speed. But after a few minutes, Li Daochong still hadn't reached the bottom. At his maximum speed, Li Daochong could easily cross 1,000,000 kilometers in just a few minutes. Traveling hundreds of thousands of kilometers was not a problem at all. However, using the 1,000 sonic escape to descend for several minutes and still not seeing the bottom, this was too strange. Master, there's a problem with the space here. Xuanyi's voice suddenly sounded. Li Daochong's eyes narrowed as he retracted his divine sense and began to investigate the state of the space. After a while, Li Daochong revealed a look of realization. There was actually a nigh-universe space below the Endless Abyss. No wonder it was called the Endless Abyss. This abyss was really endless to mortals and even ordinary cultivators. Xuanyi, no wonder the signal you received was so weak. This is really a bit far, Li Daochong said after understanding the situation. Yes, Master. I didn't expect the nigh-universe space to be connected to the outside world. Xuanyi sighed. Li Daochong nodded slightly and continued to investigate with his divine sense. He soon discovered that this nigh-universe space that was seamlessly connected to the outside world was not natural. It was also man-made. According to his deduction, this nigh-universe space should have originally existed as a secret realm. It was forcefully blasted open by a powerful force and merged with the outside world. The secrets of Black Jupiter seemed to be endless. Just when you thought you had a good understanding of this planet that had gone through many vicissitudes of life, it would present a new veil for you to pluck. Li Daochong could not help but worry about his spirit chi consumption. The 1,000 sound escape was like a glutton for spirit chi. No matter how much Li Daochong's cultivation increased, the 1,000 sound escape could only be maintained for a fixed amount of time. This was because as Li Daochong's cultivation increased, the maximum speed of the 1,000 sound escape after activating it would also increase exponentially. At this rate, the spirit chi Li Daochong recovered from killing the Devil King's devil soul would quickly be exhausted. Just as Li Daochong was about to stop using the 1,000 sound escape, his divine sense finally came into contact with a strange ball of energy. Li Daochong immediately slowed down and flew toward the ball of energy on Tsang Ink. Not long after, a light appeared in front of him. It seemed to be an exit. Li Daochong increased his speed toward the light. When he arrived at the light, he found that it was indeed a spatial gate in the shape of a cave. Looking through the hole, he saw a beautiful secret realm space. Li Daochong's divine sense probed deeper and did not find any abnormalities. The spatial gate was very stable. However, out of caution, Li Daochong still chose to send his primordial soul avatar into the spatial gate. The biggest difference between void refinement stage cultivators and soul formation stage cultivators was that they could create avatars. Li Daochong's avatar was equivalent to a surveillance camera for Li Daochong's main body. What he saw, heard, and felt was exactly the same as what Li Daochong's main body saw. This secret realm hidden at the bottom of the bottomless abyss was not very big. It could be seen in its entirety at a glance. The spatial hole was located at the top of this secret realm. There were a few mountain peaks, a few rivers, and a deep lake surrounded the mountain peaks. There was a waterfall on the mountain peak and a lush forest at the foot of the mountain. There were also grasslands and flowers, and birds chirped and flowers bloomed. It looked like a paradise on earth. Although it was not very big, it was full of life. The spirit chi was thick and viscous, with a density of more than 30%. Who would have thought that there would be such a place at the bottom of the bottomless abyss, a famous place of death on the Blackwood Star. The secret realm was not big, but that was relative to Li Daocheng's cultivation level. If it were immortal, it would be ridiculously big. There is also a small sun formed by spirit qi hanging in the sky, providing the secret realm with an endless supply of energy. Master, I heard the complete voice transmission, Shui and I immediately said. What did the voice transmission say? Li Daocheng asked curiously. Shui and I was silent for a while before saying, Master, I'm sorry. I was too sensitive and made Master waste so much time and spirit qi to come here. This voice transmission cannot be trusted. Li Daocheng was puzzled. Why can't it be trusted? Shui and I continued. The voice transmission kept repeating one sentence. Destroy the seal and teleport to the Blackwood Star. Li Daocheng was stunned after hearing this. It was a simple sentence, but it was shocking. Destroy the seal? Could it be that the gelatinous seal sealing the Blackwood Star was not protecting the Blackwood Star, but obstructing it? Teleport to the Blackwood Star? How? Li Daocheng's imagination was already wild enough, but he never thought of teleporting to an entire cultivation planet. Chapter 725. Li Daocheng's doppelganger explored the secret realm for several hours, almost inside and out, but did not find anything out of the ordinary. There were many spirit beasts living in the mystic realm, living leisurely in this seemingly man-made space. Everything in the outside world had nothing to do with this place. These spirit beasts weren't of high ranks, roughly numbering in the tens of thousands. As for the voice transmission that Shui and I had sensed, Li Daocheng couldn't sense it at all, nor did he find any signs of spirits living here. Li Daocheng even carefully examined the small sun in the sky, which was formed by spirit qi. He didn't find anything out of the ordinary. The small sun was just a product of highly concentrated spirit qi, nothing special. Li Daocheng's divine was close to that of a late-body integration old demon, but he couldn't detect anything out of the ordinary. Either there was nothing out of the ordinary in the mystic realm, or there was something out of the ordinary in the mystic realm. But no matter which one it was, this mystic realm had nothing to do with the Hades. There wasn't even a trace of naturally formed yin qi here, let alone death qi. Li Daocheng's clone left the mystic realm, and his main body slowly opened his eyes with a puzzled expression. Master, I was overthinking things. Let's leave this place. Shui and I was very apologetic for wasting so much time. Li Daocheng grunted in response and didn't say anything else. He stepped onto the Tsang ink and flew away without looking back. Li Daocheng didn't use the 1,000-sound escape this time, and it took him several hours to return to the surface. Li Daocheng stood at the edge of the abyss, quietly looking down, and then flew into the sky. He flew all the way to the gelatinous seal and hovered tens of thousands of meters in the air, looking down. He could see the entire endless abyss. Looking down from the sky, the endless abyss was a long, winding fissure. This fissure that stretched for tens of thousands of kilometers was irregular, and clearly hadn't been cleaved open by a sword. If it had been cleaved open, it wouldn't have twisted and turned, which was completely different from the spirit sea. But the more Li Daocheng looked, the more shocked and incredulous he felt. The meandering earth crevice seemed to be twisting and turning in an extremely irregular path. Many parts even made 180-degree turns before circling back. Master, did you find anything? Shui and I sensed the intense fluctuations transmitted by Li Daocheng's divine telekinesis. She also used her spiritual telekinesis to look at the endless abyss below, but she couldn't tell what was wrong. The endless abyss is also man-made. It should be the work of the immortal who split open the Blackwood Star. Li Daocheng's voice trembled slightly as he replied. Everything he had seen had a huge impact on him. Even though Li Daocheng had experienced so much, he was still stunned. Done by man? Master, I'm slow-witted. I can't tell at all, Shui and I said, puzzled. You don't understand spiritual tattoos, so of course you can't tell. I really don't know what kind of battle happened on the Blackwood Star. The immortal's cultivation was already very high, but he still couldn't do anything to the other side. The immortal left behind a number of insurance measures to protect the Blackwood Star and ensure that the Blackwood Star wouldn't be destroyed by the Hades. This endless abyss is actually a spiritual tattoo or a spiritual array that the immortal engraved on the Blackwood Star. Li Daocheng shared his conjecture. Hiss! Shui and I gasped. Engraving spiritual tattoos on a cultivation planet. What kind of amazing skill was that? After Li Daocheng finished speaking, he swooped down and entered the mine at the edge of the endless abyss. He spread out his divine telekinesis and quickly found a few weak spatial nodes. Li Daocheng split a few strands of his divine telekinesis into the spatial nodes to check the situation on the other side. Although Li Daocheng's divine telekinesis was strong, it wasn't strong enough to penetrate space. He could only roughly determine whether there was spiritual qi on the other side. Li Daocheng's keen perception of space came in handy at this moment. Chu Qinyue's training from back then was once again showing its effectiveness. If there was spiritual qi on the other side of the spatial node, it meant that it was within the Blue Bay Star. Although this space was sealed, the Blue Bay Star was on the other side of its many spatial nodes. If there was spiritual qi on the other side of the spatial node, it was undoubtedly within the Blue Bay Star. If there was no spiritual qi, then it was certain that it wasn't on the Blue Bay Star. Perhaps it was in the stars near the Blue Bay Star or some other void space. Li Daocheng only needed to find a spatial node without spiritual qi on the other side. Then he could use the lightning talisman to break through space. This way, he could ensure that the Blue Bay Star wouldn't be damaged. As for how far the spatial rift was from the Blue Bay Star, it didn't matter anymore. He had to escape from the black Jupiter star first. After careful exploration, Li Daocheng found 2 spatial nodes and finally decided on a safer spatial node. After confirming the spatial location, Li Daocheng didn't immediately use the lightning talisman. Instead, he left a mark and set up an invisibility spiritual array. Then he left. Shui and I was once again stunned by Li Daocheng's actions. She didn't know what he was planning to do. Shouldn't he use the lightning talisman to break through space? Li Daocheng flew straight to the sky and once again arrived in front of the gelatinous seal. He stretched out his hand, and the Tsang ink appeared in his hand. All of a sudden, spiritual qi erupted from his body. "Master, what are you?" Shui and I cried out in shock. She could vaguely guess what Li Daocheng was going to do. "Destroy the seal," Li Daocheng said faintly. "Master, isn't it too risky? How trustworthy can a message from an unknown source be?" Shui and I reminded him. "Anyway, the Hades have already discovered the black Jupiter star. This layer of seal will be broken sooner or later. If we leave, the black Jupiter star will become a dead star soon. Since that's the case, we might as well speed up the process. The result will be the same anyway. It's better to believe the message from the elves echoing in the endless abyss than not. If the Hades break the seal, the power of the seal will completely disappear. If what the message said is true, then it won't come true. So let's verify it. Even if it doesn't work, we still have enough time to break through space and leave this place." Li Daocheng explained his idea. Xueni's little face in the Tsang ink revealed a look of approval when she heard this. All of Li Daocheng's spiritual qi surged wildly into his right hand. The Tsang ink buzzed and crackled. Electric currents flowed back and forth on the blade like dancing electric fairies. Great Void Third Sword. All things return to origin. Boom, zong, following the deafening sound of thunder. A saber projection imbued with terrifying lightning power slashed out. It was much easier to destroy the seal from the inside out than from the outside in. Even so, it was not easy to break the seal from the inside out. It took the 2 demons a lot of effort to create a small opening. Although their powers were restricted, 60 to 70% of their power was still quite terrifying. Of course, the seal was created from spiritual qi, so it was extremely resistant to death qi, demonic qi, and dark qi. Hence, it was much more difficult for the dark demon to break the seal. However, Li Daocheng was different. He was a cultivator, so the spiritual chi flowing through his body was spiritual chi. The seal had almost no resistance to Li Daochong, so it was much easier for Li Daochong to break the seal. Li Daochong did not hold back at all. He unleashed his most powerful attack, which was imbued with immense destructive power. This attack gave off the illusion of being able to split open the void. The brilliance spread out over 1,000 kilometers. Bang! The saber projection struck the gelatinous seal, causing sparks to flash along the line. A 1,000-kilometer-long crack was forcibly created on the gelatinous seal, which was expanding at an astonishing speed. On the other side of the seal, several hundred Hades arcane masters who had been using dark arts day and night to erode the seal were swallowed by the saber projection before they could react. Beep. 531 dark arts killed. Soul energy converted. Spiritual chi obtained. A notification rang out in Li Daochong's mind. The spiritual chi he had consumed was immediately replenished. Li Daochong did not take another look at the completely broken seal. He turned around and dove towards the mine without hesitation. Once the seal was broken, it would not be long before the Hades army swarmed in a Black Tree Star. Li Daochong had to leave Black Tree Star before the Hades could react. However, just as Li Daochong was about to enter the mine, the seal covering the entire Black Tree Star flashed brightly. Immediately after, a huge vortex appeared above the endless abyss. The gelatinous seal rapidly disintegrated into fragments and was sucked into the vortex. A beam of light several kilometers thick shot out of the vortex and into the endless abyss. The crevice in the ground that was tens of thousands of kilometers long radiated radiance in all directions and was instantly filled with spiritual light. Chapter 726. Li Daochong's conjecture was correct. The endless abyss was the spirit pattern engraved on Blackwood Star, and the spirit energy that triggered the spirit pattern came from Blackwood Star's seal. Such a massive spirit pattern required a terrifying amount of spirit energy. Otherwise, it would not be able to activate the spirit pattern. The seal disintegrated extremely quickly. It was continuously absorbed into the vortex, turned into spirit energy, and shot into the endless abyss. Li Daochong did not know what this majestic spirit pattern left behind by an immortal would trigger. Without thinking too much about it, Li Daochong directly rushed into the mine. He couldn't care less about what would happen to Black Tree Star. Whether they would be teleported to a safe area or trigger some powerful spirit array to protect Blackwood Star again, he did not know. Li Daochong destroying the seal was just an experiment for the sake of the surviving mortals on Blackwood Star. If Xuanyi's message was true, then it might be able to save the mortals on Blackwood Star. Li Daochong had done everything he could. As for the fate of the mortals on Black Tree Planet, that would depend on their own luck. Li Daochong entered the mine and quickly found the mark he had left behind. He took out the lightning gathering talisman and aimed it at the spatial node. "Go!" Li Daochong shouted. The lightning gathering talisman shot out with dazzling sparks. A ball of light made of spirit energy and spiritual will was placed at the spatial node. The lightning gathering talisman hit the ball of light. In an instant, blinding lightning flashed. Boom! Terrifying lightning energy was released in an instant. Lightning energy's penetrative power was the strongest among all the elements. Moreover, it would not explode in all directions. Instead, it would focus on a single point. Buzz, the astonishing lightning energy pierced through space, forming a circular spatial rift with a diameter of more than 5 meters. Although the lightning energy released by the lightning gathering talisman was terrifying, it did not cause much damage. All the energy was concentrated in a single line, piercing through space and shooting to the other side of the spatial rift. Li Daochong did not hesitate. With a whoosh, he disappeared from the spot, passing through the spatial rift to the other side. After passing through the spatial rift, Li Daochong arrived in a starry sky. There was nothing around him, and there were no planets nearby. However, as far as the eye could see, the stars were twinkling in the distance. Countless bright stars could be seen. The blue bay star was not nearby. Li Daochong had no idea where he was at the moment. He raised his wrist and looked at his watch. The simplest way to confirm whether or not this space zone was the human domain was to turn on his wristwatch and see if he could access the spiritual nexus. If he were in the Hades, he would not be able to access the spiritual nexus. Right when Li Daochong was about to try to connect his wristwatch to the spiritual nexus, the space around him suddenly trembled violently. Li Daochong frowned slightly, not knowing what was going on. Instinctively, he activated the 1,000 sonar escape technique to escape this space. Li Daochong had just flown a few dozen kilometers when a huge suction force pulled him back. Li Daochong felt a chill run down his spine. His intuition told him that something was wrong. Could it be that he did not escape from the Hades and was discovered by Sakyamappa? Okay. The trembling of the space became more and more intense, and it felt like it would collapse at any moment. Suddenly, a dazzling brilliance lit up in the starry sky. There was no sound, only a blinding brilliance. Ha! Like the shutter of a camera. In the blink of an eye, not far from where Li Daochong was, a huge planet appeared out of thin air. Li Daochong floated above the starry sky, watching everything in a daze. If he had not seen it with his own eyes, even in a world where cultivators and nether ghosts coexisted, he would not have been able to believe it. Li Daochong also found it hard to believe that such a thing could happen. Li Daochong looked down at the planet that had suddenly appeared in the starry sky. In the blink of an eye, his dazed state disappeared. Looking closely, wasn't this the black Jupiter planet? Master, the Endless Abyss is actually a giant teleportation rune that the immortals carved on the surface of the black Jupiter planet. Shui and I could not help but exclaim. Amazing skills and extraordinary imagination. Li Daochong sighed. After saying that, Li Daochong's telepathic telekinesis sensed a lot of death aura. His expression froze, and he stepped on Tsang ink and flew toward the atmosphere of the black Jupiter planet. The thousands of underworld masters who were dismantling the seal did not have time to evacuate and were teleported here along with the black Jupiter planet. These underworld masters were not very aggressive and were not suitable for battle-type nether demons. However, they were much more dangerous than battle-type nether demons. Thousands of inscribers only needed a few days to transform a small cultivator planet like the Blue Bay Star into a death planet suitable for nether demons to descend. This was much faster than the low-level nether demons slowly eroding a planet. Therefore, these underworld masters could not be left alive. Li Daochong did not hesitate in the slightest and immediately began a massacre. If these underworld masters were allowed to escape, the consequences would be unimaginable. He had to kill them all before they could react. Otherwise, the coordinates of this starry sky would be quickly discovered by Sakyamappa. Li Daochong released his telepathic telekinesis and enveloped all the death aura. Then, he turned into a beam of light and rushed forward. Telekinesis attacks. I have Thunder Punishment, 9 splits saber technique. Li Daochong spared no effort in unleashing all his large-scale attacks. He wiped out all the underworld masters in the periphery of the Blackwood Star as quickly as possible. Every time he killed an underworld master, a notification would sound in Li Daochong's spiritual sea. His spirit chi was recovering at an astonishing speed. The depleted spirit chi was recovered in a few seconds. These underworld masters were not low-level cultivators. However, Li Daochong's cultivation had reached the void refinement stage, and his combat power was comparable to that of a late-stage body integration stage old demon. In an instant, he killed thousands of underworld masters. As he killed, not only did his spirit chi not deplete, it even increased. After a few minutes, there were only a few underworld masters left. Only a few who had teleported here from a farther place had managed to escape for the time being. Li Daochong naturally would not let any of them escape. He activated the 1,000-sound escape technique to the maximum. He was as fast as lightning. In an instant, he caught up with the fleeing underworld masters and killed them one by one without mercy. Li Daocheng's spiritual sea could not detect the death chi, but he was still worried. He circled around the periphery of the black wood star several times. He had accumulated a lot of spirit chi by killing underworld masters. This time, he used it all up. Li Daocheng's caution paid off. More than a dozen underworld masters hid at the bottom of the spirit sea, tried to avoid being hunted down. Li Daocheng would not let them go. He would kill them as soon as he found them. After confirming that there were no underworld masters left, Li Daocheng stopped. Then he turned on his wristwatch and connected to the spiritual internet. Li Daocheng looked at the display on his wristwatch anxiously. Beep! There was a crisp sound. The connection was successful. Li Daocheng's eyes flashed. The successful connection meant that he had returned to the spiritual realm of the human realm. Although he did not know where he was, as long as he was not in the Hades, Li Daocheng's danger level would be greatly reduced. Li Daocheng immediately entered the spiritual internet. There was a familiar window and a familiar spiritual void realm interface. Blue Bay Star. This was the interface of the Blue Bay Star's spiritual internet. Li Daocheng was overjoyed. He was back. He was finally back. Chapter 727. Finally returning to the human realm, Li Daocheng was not in a hurry to go back. Since he was no longer in the Hades, he was not in a hurry. There were too many secrets on Black Jupiter that needed to be unraveled. The Endless Abyss was a huge spirit pattern engraved on the planet. Li Daocheng was very interested in it. In addition, he also wanted to know what was hidden in the secret realm hidden at the bottom of the abyss. In addition, Li Daocheng also wanted to study the thunder clouds that existed permanently above Thunder Island. Of course, in order to reassure Silver Bottle and the others, Li Daocheng contacted them through the spiritual intranet. Silver Bottle was naturally overjoyed to know that Li Daocheng had returned safely to the human realm. In order not to worry Li Daocheng, Silver Bottle did not tell him about the recent crisis that the Li family had encountered. This time, Silver Bottle did not want to be a burden. She wanted to rely on her own strength to help the Li family survive this crisis. Li Daocheng only needed to cultivate and become stronger. Because of Silver Bottle's concealment, Li Daocheng did not know what had happened on Blue Bay Star. After reporting that he had returned, Li Daocheng immersed himself in studying the mysteries of the Endless Abyss. After Black Jupiter left the Hades, the remaining death aura dissipated faster and faster. This huge planet, which was equivalent to a first-class cultivation planet back then, was rapidly recovering. The star field that Li Daocheng was teleported to was quite far from Blue Bay Star. It was not even in the 4th ring star zone, but in an area between the 5th ring star zone and the 4th ring star zone of the Federation. There happened to be a star in its prime, and Black Jupiter was teleported to the perfect location. Black Jupiter was full of vitality under the illumination of this new sun. Half a year later, Li Daocheng wiped out all the remaining nether ghosts on Black Jupiter. Of course, Li Daocheng did not need to deal with these remnants. He left them to Shabi and Xuan'ai. Li Daocheng spent all his time and energy studying the Endless Abyss and the thunderclouds on Thunder Island. During this period of time, his cultivation did not increase much, but Li Daocheng's understanding of spirit pattern engraving had reached a new level. He could already make level 23 spirit talismans. The thunderclouds on Thunder Island provided Li Daocheng with endless thunder power. Immersed in it, his thunder-nascent soul grew rapidly and was close to the thunder primordial spirit state. Li Daocheng had gone to the secret realm in the abyss twice before handing it over to Xuan'ai for research. That secret realm seemed to be a product of the elves. Xuan'ai was very familiar with the environment there, and she was clearly more suited than Li Daocheng to search for the secrets inside. Another half a year passed, and Xuan'ai's growth rate was astonishing. She had actually absorbed a small portion of the spirit chi in the mystic realm. Xuan'ai rose from yuaning primordial spirit to late-stage soul formation. This growth speed was unimaginable in the outside world. When she reached the late stage of the divine transformation realm, Shui and I was no longer confined to the azure ink saber. She condensed a spiritual body, which could appear in the form of a physical body or exist in the form of a spirit in the azure ink saber. A year passed unknowingly. Li Daocheng lived every day to the fullest, as if he could not feel the passage of time. If he did not receive Li Qingyao's urgent voice transmission, Li Daocheng had no intention of returning to Blue Bay Star. Big brother, Silver Bottle is in danger. Please come back within 5 days. Li Qingyao only sent a short message, and then there was no more news. Li Daocheng tried to contact Li Qingyao, but there was no response. He also did not get any response from the others. The Blue Bay Star seemed to have been isolated. He could not access the Blue Bay Star's interface, even if he logged onto the SpiritNet. Li Daocheng felt that something was wrong. He immediately stepped onto Tsang Inc. and rushed out of Blackwood Star with Shabi. Spatial tempering cultivators did not need any tools to fly freely in space. There was a miniature space shuttle in Li Daocheng's storage ring, but that thing wasn't even as fast as he was flying. If he rode the Federation's most advanced space shuttle to Blue Bay Star, it would take half a month, and he would have to go through a teleportation formation in between. However, Li Daocheng could fly on his own, so he did not need to go through a teleportation formation. Without using the 1,000 sound escape technique, he could reach Blue Bay Star in about a week. Using the 1,000 sound escape technique would shorten the time by 20 times. In other words, he could reach Blue Bay Star in less than half a day. However, the 1,000 sound escape technique could only be used for 20 minutes, and it consumed a lot of energy. Li Daocheng did not need to use it unless he had no other choice. Of course, a week was still too long. Li Qingyao had said 5 days. Li Daocheng could not contact anyone at this moment. He could not help but feel a little anxious. He did not know what had happened to Blue Bay Star. Fortunately, Li Daocheng had collected a lot of spirit herbs in the past year on Blackwood Star, and he had refined a few supreme-grade recovery spirit pills. This allowed him to use the 1,000 sound escape technique up to 3 times without consuming too much of his spirit energy. At the same time, Li Daocheng could also use the miniature space shuttle to go through a teleportation formation. In this way, Li Daocheng would only need 3 or 4 days to reach Blue Bay Star. The reason Li Daocheng could not get in touch with Blue Bay Star was because the Federation had set the biennial Federation Peak Chamber of Commerce to be held on Blue Bay Star. In terms of rank, a 4th-class cultivation planet like Blue Bay Star would never get a chance to attend. The reason why it had been chosen this time was because of the Li Group's rapid development in the past few years. Since 2 years ago, the Li Group had become the public enemy of all the major cultivation companies in the Federation. However, this change in direction had attracted a large number of high-level cultivators and cultivation companies to the Indigo Bay planet. In just 2 or 3 years, the number of permanent cultivators on Blue Bay Star had exceeded 100,000. Jindan cultivators were no longer rare. There were hundreds of Yuanian cultivators. There were even rumors that soul formation cultivators had come to Blue Bay Star. This originally remote and barren 4th-class cultivation planet had suddenly become a hot commodity. Blue Bay Star had been replenished with a large amount of resources. Whether it was the planet itself or the number of cultivators, it had far exceeded the standard that a 4th-class cultivation planet should have. It was really unreasonable not to upgrade Blue Bay Star, so the Federation reluctantly upgraded Blue Bay Star by 1 level. More than a year ago, Blue Bay Star had officially become a 3rd-class cultivation planet. In fact, a 3rd-class cultivation planet was not enough. However, since the establishment of the Federation, there had never been a cultivation planet that had jumped 2 levels at once. Because of Blue Bay Star's existence, the entire 4th ring star zone had become lively. 2 years ago, the Li Group had encountered an unprecedented crisis. Just as it was about to collapse, Silver Bottle had returned with a large amount of resources and spirit stones. Coupled with Li Qianyang's business acumen, the Li Group had withstood the suppression. Not only had it not shrunk its scope of operations, it had even continued to expand. Those cultivation companies that had been suppressing the League groups saw that their resistance was futile, and they had suffered even more losses. In order to survive, many cultivation companies had no choice but to cooperate with the League group in search of a win-win situation. A year ago, the 8 major cultivation companies of the Federation had joined forces with the Emperor group of the Nankuan Empire and the Hay Security to encircle and suppress the League group. A large amount of financial resources had almost taken down the League group. Unfortunately, the slightest difference had led to a huge error. Under the leadership of a female card slave, the League group had endured hardships and endured hardships. The initial defeat was just a facade. In fact, the League group's funds were much more robust than it looked. Silver Bottle had become famous in one battle. At the same time, the old man who often followed Silver Bottle had also become famous. The old man was naturally the heavily injured old ancestor Tian Feng. Silver Bottle was his savior. Old ancestor Tian Feng's injuries were almost irreversible. His strength had decreased greatly, but he still had his experience and wisdom. This was a body integration stage, being from one of the 3 major cultivation empires. So there was no way that a bunch of trash from the Federation would be able to defeat him. When Yutian Feng, Wu Yutian Cherry Blossom Gauze, who in the Shanghua Federation could defeat him. Silver Bottle's strength was not weak. At least in the Federation, she was definitely considered a great expert in the late stage of yuanying. In addition, Silver Bottle was diligent and eager to learn. In order to share Li Daocheng's worries and difficulties, she was not willing to waste even a second. In terms of management, Li Tianyang and old ancestor Tian Feng taught and taught. Silver Bottle was like a sponge that absorbed nutrients hungrily. Not only did her identity as a card slave not become her shackle, but also became a booster for her to work harder. When a person forgot themselves, any difficulty would not be an obstacle. It would only make her stronger. Silver Bottle's trip to the Black Prison with Li Daocheng had made her grow a lot. She had also learned a lot. She finally understood Li Daocheng's good intentions. More importantly, Silver Bottle dreamily felt a trace of Li Daocheng's different feelings for her. This was the key to Silver Bottle's complete potential. The extravagant hope that she had buried deep in her heart seemed to have the possibility of being realized. However, the young master was so powerful. Silver Bottle knew that she was not worthy of the young master at all. She could only grow a little bit closer to him if she worked hard. Silver Bottle had obtained so many opportunities with Li Daocheng's help, but she felt that she still could not get close to Li Daocheng in terms of cultivation. Therefore, Silver Bottle began to find another way. If she could reach a certain height in other aspects, she would be able to solve the young master's problems and become his right-hand woman. It was also a kind of approach. Silver Bottle's efforts were not in vain. In 2 years, she had become the representative of the Li group. Her prestige had even surpassed Li Tianyang's. Li Tianyang did not mind at all. He already had the intention to give up his position. If it was not for the fact that there was no one in the Li family who could replace Li Tianyang, he would not have stood at the front to run the Li group. Li Tianyang still preferred to cultivate. However, his position as the chairman of the Li group kept him very busy and did not have time to cultivate. Now that he had Silver Bottle, Li Tianyang was happy and relaxed. He had the idea of passing his position to Silver Bottle. After a beautiful turnaround a year ago, the Li group once again stabilized the situation. The year that had just passed was still considered stable. There were occasional small waves, but it was still within the normal range. However, just as everyone let down their guard and focused on external development, 2 of the 3 major shareholders of the Li group died inexplicably, and the shares were inherited by the next generation. Not long after the inheritance, the shares were transferred. The other major shareholder migrated to the Nankuan Empire and openly sold the shares of the Li group. The shares of these 3 major shareholders were all bought by Shanghua Mining. Immediately, the Federation's high-peak Chamber of Commerce was set to be in the Blue Bay Star. 3 days later, several branches of the League Group were investigated for violating the Federation's regulations. Then, Princess Catherine's number 18 Talisman Company Limited was found to be bribing the Federation's high officials and operating improperly. Princess Catherine was directly arrested, and Old Devil Zhang was also imprisoned. In the following month, the League Group fell into a loss for the first time. All kinds of scandals were exposed. There were also reports that Silver Bottle was a card slave spy. In short, all kinds of negative reports were overwhelming. Li Tianyang had not prepared the foundation for passing his position to Silver Bottle. Silver Bottle's position as the chief financial officer was a little unstable. This time, even Silver Bottle was a little confused. Under the guidance of old ancestor Tian Feng, the counterattack had little effect. The other party struck like lightning. It was obviously unrealistic to want to immediately turn the situation around. At this juncture, the Federation's high-peak Chamber of Commerce was about to convene. Silver Bottle had to put the counterattack matter aside and wait for the Chamber of Commerce to be over before making a plan. The Federation's high-peak Chamber of Commerce was the top chamber of commerce in the Federation. Every time it was convened, it involved the allocation of resources in the entire Federation. All the attendees were the top bosses of the Shenghua Federation. At the same time, there were also related cultivation enterprises from the neighboring Ankuan Empire. Therefore, security measures naturally had to be done well, and business secrets had to be protected. Therefore, during the Chamber of Commerce, all kinds of spiritual sense signals were blocked. Only specific encrypted signal sources and official signal sources could be used. This caused Li Daocheng to be unable to contact anyone on the Blue Bay Star. 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. The Federation's high-peak Chamber of Commerce, which was the focus of attention in the Federation, was officially convened. At noon, the newly built star building of the Blue Bay Star was bustling with noise and excitement. There was an endless stream of cultivators flying around the building, flying up and down. The streets were flooded with people, and there were countless officials and nobles coming in and out of the building's main entrance. Luxurious flying shuttles came one after another, and some even rode on heaven-level Dharma treasures, which attracted a lot of attention. Media from all over gathered in the media reception area, fighting to report on this Chamber of Commerce. In a reception room next to the large conference hall on the 6th floor of the Star Building, Silver Bottle bit her lower lip and looked angrily at a young man in front of her. Patriarch Tianfeng was restrained by 2 cultivator bodyguards beside the young man. Li Tianyang was also knocked down by a guy whose aura couldn't be felt. Director Yin, what do you mean by this? Silver Bottle's heart was in turmoil, but she still asked with a calm and angry expression. Director Yin, do you still need to ask? As long as you agree to be engaged with me, all the problems your League Group is facing will be solved. Otherwise, today's high-peak Chamber of Commerce will be the day your League Group disbands, Yin Dufeng said with a smile. While speaking, Yin Dufeng emitted a strong spirit chi to suppress Silver Bottle. The latter's eyes were filled with shock. Silver Bottle didn't expect Yin Dufeng to be at the late-stage soul formation stage. Chapter 728. Were soul formation realm cultivators so worthless? Yinping thought to herself. There was a hint of anger in her eyes, but she didn't panic. Yinping didn't care about Yin Dufeng, even if he was a late-stage soul formation realm cultivator. Patriarch Tianfeng was easily restrained by 2 Yuanian cultivators. His old face stiffened, and his heart was filled with hatred. A combination realm cultivator couldn't even deal with a Yuanian cultivator. That kind of difference wasn't something that ordinary people could understand. Li Tianyang was a big shot in Blue Bay Star, and his combat strength was outstanding. But in the 3 great cultivation empires, he was nothing. The man who defeated Li Tianyang only used 1 move, and no one present could sense his aura. This strange man was an assassin. Yinping didn't need to guess to know that this person was most likely from the Misty Shadow, and behind the Misty Shadow stood the Dark Knight. They could easily dispatch a few powerful assassins to come over. The Yin family was the actual controller of the Emperor Group in the non-Korean Empire, and they held more than half of the shares. The Emperor Group had been eyeing the Li Group covetously for the past 2 years. They mainly focused on the talisman business. They originally held about 70% of the shares in the Shanghua Federation, but in the past 2 years, the Li Group had eaten up less than 10%. The talismans produced by the number 18 Talisman Company, limited under the Li Group, were cheap and powerful. Whether it was for commercial or military use, they were very useful. The Emperor Group's profits in the Federation had been greatly reduced. Therefore, the Emperor Group began to counterattack the Li Group. They were the ones who took the lead in swallowing the Li Group's shares back then. But after using many methods, they still couldn't do anything to the Li Group. Until recently, they used some extreme methods and joined forces with the Federation's representative, Yi Songhai, and the Federation's Soul Formation Realm Cultivator, Perfected Lord Yin. With the help of these two, the Emperor Group could do whatever they wanted in the Federation. But even so, the Li Group was not bitten by the Emperor Group. After one plan failed, they came up with another. The first thing the Yin family thought of was a marriage alliance. This was the best way to swallow the Li Group's shares and take over the power. Therefore, a few months ago, they began to propose marriage to Yinping. How could the silver bottle agree? She didn't even bother to respond. She didn't want the betrothal gifts and ignored everything else. However, the Yin family was extremely thick-skinned. They sent people to the Li family almost every day to propose marriage. A few days ago, a conflict finally broke out. The people sent by the Yin clan were chased away by Li Tianyang. Cherry Blossom Gauze secretly crippled several cultivators from the Emperor Group. This infuriated the Yin clan. Using the Chamber of Commerce as an excuse, they decided to use violence and force Yinping to agree to the engagement. Silver Bottle was dressed in white. After a few years, she was no longer the weak and petite little girl from back then. Although Silver Bottle was a card slave, under Li Daocheng's strong support, his bloodline had already undergone a fundamental change. In the past few years, Silver Bottle's cultivation base had grown quickly, and her body's development had far exceeded the limit of what a card slave should have. She was more than 7 meters tall, taller than some men. She had a curvaceous figure, a slim waist, and a perky butt. Anyone couldn't help but take a second look at her. It wasn't enough to say that she had a devilish figure. Not only that, but Silver Bottle's appearance was also superb. In fact, although card slaves were physically weak, their people had always been very good-looking. She had a fine nose, phoenix eyes, red lips, crescent brows, and skin as white as snow. Yinping had long become the goddess of Blue Bay Star. She was better than all the beautiful women on Blue Bay Star. Silver Bottle's business activities in the past 2 years were relatively ordinary. No matter what kind of woman she was, as long as she stood next to Yinping, she would immediately pale in comparison. Of course, Yinping's cultivation base also played a big role in Yuanix. The higher the cultivation base of a female cultivator, the different their temperament and aura would be. In fact, Yin Dufeng didn't want to marry Yinping for the family's benefit. As far as he was concerned, it was because he was greedy for beauty. If he could have Yinping, who was a superb card slave, he would have endless benefits in the future. In Yin Dufeng's eyes, card slaves were card slaves. No matter how they changed, they were just slaves. Of course, there were also good and bad slaves. Yinping was the best choice for a top slave. Yinping looked at Yin Dufeng and smiled. Director Yin, it takes courage to propose to me. Your courage is commendable. Yin Dufeng was stunned. He didn't understand what Yinping meant. He then laughed. Ha ha, Miss Yinping, thank you for your praise. I, Yin Dufeng, lack everything but courage. Miss Yinping, to tell you the truth, this time the Federation's High Peak Chamber of Commerce is going to establish a new company called Blue Bay Group. Yinping tilted her head. Blue Bay Group? Yin Dufeng continued. That's right. As the name suggests, it's a merger of all the cultivation companies on Blue Bay Star. This time the Chamber of Commerce is going to choose the chairman of the Blue Bay Group. You think it's going to be established just because you say so? Did the Li Group agree? Yinping suddenly felt that something was wrong, and said coldly, "Ha ha ha, Missing Ping, you still don't seem to understand the situation. Your Li group has no right to speak. Today, as long as the Federation votes, your Li group will cease to exist. From now on, there will only be one cultivation company on Blue Bay Star called Blue Bay Group," Yin Dufeng said proudly. Li Tianyang covered his chest and looked at Yin Dufeng angrily. He wanted to punch that face. Unfortunately, he was restrained by the strange man and couldn't move. Despicable. Yin Ping had nothing to say to this group of people who would stop at nothing. Missing Ping, how can this be called despicable? The business world is like a battlefield. All businessmen are evil. No matter what method is used, as long as you achieve your goal, it's a good method, isn't it? Your Li group has offended too many people in the past 2 years. Who doesn't want you to be finished early? Ha ha, this is what everyone wants. Yin Dufeng laughed again. Yin Ping clenched her teeth and her eyes were cold. Missing Ping, a wise man, submits to circumstances. Now isn't the worst time. As long as you agree to marry me, you will be the young mistress of the Emperor Group. How can Elite Group compare to the Emperor Group? The difference is like an ant and an elephant. Which is more important? You should know very well. Yin Dufeng narrowed his eyes and couldn't help but glance at Yin Ping's bulging breasts. Yin Ping was secretly anxious. She wasn't in a hurry just now because Cherry Blossom Gauze had something to do with the Ghost Manor and would come soon. Yin Ping was just stalling for time with Yin Dufeng. However, Cherry Blossom Gauze didn't show any signs of appearing. Did something go wrong? Yin Ping tried to contact Cherry Blossom Gauze several times, but to no avail. Who could stop Cherry Blossom Gauze? As time passed, Yin Ping felt that something was wrong. With Cherry Blossom Gauze's personality, it was impossible for her to be so slow. Yin Ping's guess was right. At this moment, on the Blue Bay, Sea more than 1,000 kilometers away from Tianyuan City, a masked man in an assassin's uniform intercepted Cherry Blossom Gauze. He had been tracking Cherry Blossom Gauze for a long time, but he didn't know the Cherry Blossom Gauze's exact whereabouts. However, through his tracking, he had a basic understanding of the areas where Cherry Blossom Gauze often appeared. Today, as expected, the assassin successfully intercepted Cherry Blossom Gauze here. When they first met, Cherry Blossom Gauze didn't take the assassin seriously at all. Not many people in the 3 great cultivation empires could stop her, let alone the Shenghua Federation. If there wasn't a late-stage void refinement cultivator, they would just be here to die. However, when they really started fighting, Cherry Blossom Gauze realized that the assassin in front of her was almost as strong as the assassins who appeared in the Black Prison. In terms of actual combat strength, Cherry Blossom Gauze was still stronger than this person, but Cherry Blossom Gauze's strength was reduced under the premise that she didn't want to expose her ghostly aura. As a result, Cherry Blossom Gauze was no match for this person and was forced to retreat. However, after a few exchanges, the assassin realized that it was impossible for him to kill Cherry Blossom Gauze, so he decided not to use any more vicious moves. He just needed to stall Cherry Blossom Gauze. Yin Ping's biggest reliance was being held back, which was equivalent to the League Group's last line of insurance. The situation immediately became precarious, and they could be crushed at any time. Yin Ping and Cherry Blossom Gauze weren't the only ones who were stopped. At the same time, Li Qingyao, Ling Fei, and Xiaoing were also stopped on the 3rd floor of the Star Sky building. Everything that happened today was premeditated. This time, the Federation's Feng Chamber of Commerce was completely targeted at the Li Group. Not many people knew about the Li family's current crisis. Even if they knew, no one would care. There were probably even more people who were gloating over their misfortune. At this moment, the hall on the 1st floor of the Star Sky building was filled with dignitaries and dignitaries. All of them were surrounded by people with extraordinary status. Without at least 5 followers, one would be embarrassed to greet them. Without riding in a luxurious flying shuttle that cost hundreds of millions of Federation dollars, one would be embarrassed to enter the building. A black-haired young man in a casual robe, black cloth shoes, and a pair of sunglasses walked leisurely into the hall on the 1st floor of the Star Sky building. Along the way, The black-haired young man attracted a lot of attention. Many people looked at him with curiosity in their eyes. In fact, it wasn't the black-haired young man who attracted people's attention. It was the beautiful woman behind him. From the way the black-haired young man was dressed, he was neither a dignitary nor a descendant of a big family. He looked very unfamiliar. His clothes didn't look expensive at first glance. He was obviously an ordinary person. But why would such a young brat have such a peerless beauty following behind him? As soon as this woman appeared, she surpassed all the other women. Even those female cultivators in the Jindan and Yuanying stages were far inferior to her. As long as a man of status came here, there would be 1 or 2 women or female cultivators behind him. No one's followers could compare to this young man. That woman was so beautiful that it was suffocating. She was the kind that one couldn't look away after looking at her. The black-haired young man was naturally Li Daocheng, who had rushed all the way here without stopping. Behind him was Shui and I, who could already transform into a spiritual body. 10,000 ghosts devouring system. Chapter 729. Li Daocheng only arrived at Blue Bay Star a few hours ago. He didn't alert anyone, not even Yin Ping. When Li Daocheng was hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from Blue Bay Star, he sent a strand of his soul into Blue Bay Star. Li Daocheng was filled with endless anger. If something really happened to the Li Corporation, his soul probed. All the participants would be buried with them. However, after probing, they found that everyone in the Li group was still alive and well. They did not encounter any mishaps. Li Daocheng's anger dissipated instantly. As long as everyone was fine, everything else was trivial. But since Li Qingyao sent that kind of message for help, something must have happened. Li Daocheng used his soul to sneak into the servers of Blue Bay Star's major spiritual computers. From the various trade data and share transactions, he immediately understood that the Li Corporation was being attacked by various major cultivation enterprises. Li Daocheng could only sneer in his heart. Since these fellows wanted to play, then he would play along with them. Li Daocheng wanted to see what kind of tricks these guys could play when they tried to take over the Li Corporation. If he showed up in public, it would naturally alert the other party. But investigating the data in the spiritual computers couldn't give Li Daocheng a detailed understanding of the situation. So Li Daocheng contacted Wei Ziying. The latter had a good understanding of what the Li family had been through in the past 2 years. After listening to Wei Ziying's brief description, Li Daocheng already knew who the main forces against the Li Corporation were. They were roughly divided into 3 major forces. One was the internal forces of the Federation, led by Federation Councilman Yi Songhai and Lord Yin Yan. The second force was the Emperor group of the An Kuan Empire, led by the major shareholder, the Yin family. The third force was the most mysterious. It was a security company called Miss Shadow. Li Daocheng had never heard of this cultivation company. At first, he was wondering why Miss Shadow was against the Li family. According to Wei Ziying's analysis, the one behind this was most likely the Dark Knight. If it was the Dark Knight, everything would make sense. When Li Daocheng first contacted Wei Ziying, the latter reacted as if she had seen a ghost. Even her tone was different from usual. Li Daocheng was baffled by Wei Ziying's reaction. He only understood after listening to the latter's explanation. It turned out that the various forces all thought that he had died. This was also the fundamental reason why Qin Zhan wanted to protect the Li family, but no one in the army responded. Even the goddess Hong Yang did not make a sound, as if she had been warned. After the battle with 13 Spectre, Rado Shinji's true identity was unknown to the general public, but a small number of people in the upper echelons of the Federation and the military knew about it. Therefore, Rado Shinji was one of the reasons why the Li family developed so quickly. Under the pressure of Rado Shinji, no one in the entire Shanghua Federation dared to go against the Li family. However, if Rado Shinji died, then everything would be different. A family or a cultivation company without the protection of a powerhouse would never be able to develop and grow. No matter how smart or talented a business operator was, It was useless. In the face of absolute power, everything else was meaningless. Whether it was the Federation or the three great cultivation empires, any large cultivation company would have a powerhouse behind them. This was a protective umbrella and also a deterrent to outsiders. Otherwise, as long as you developed a little, you would be destroyed in the bud by various forces. No one could accept another person sharing the sweet and delicious cake, unless they could not touch that person. Once the news of Li Daocheng's death spread, the Li family corporation lost its protective umbrella. Who would be afraid of a family from a mere fourth-class cultivation planet? Yi Songhai and Lord Silverflame teamed up to deal with the Li family, and the Dark Night added fuel to the fire. Li Daocheng could understand this. After all, there was a grudge between them. Li Daocheng didn't understand why the Yin family from the Emperor group of the Kuan Empire came to the Blue Bay, starred a meddle in their business. He didn't even know what the hell the Emperor group was. Just because the Li family corporation developed rapidly and swallowed up their market share in the Federation, they wanted to kill the Li family? Li Daocheng's killing intent towards the Yin family was instantly born. After Li Daocheng had a rough understanding of the situation, he immediately brought Shui and I to the Star Building to participate in the Peak Chamber of Commerce that was obviously targeting the Li family corporation. Li Daocheng wanted to see who dared to target the Li family corporation. There were already many influential people in the reception hall on the first floor of the Star Building, waiting for the Chamber of Commerce to begin. From time to time, some powerful people would enter the building one after another. Li Daocheng put his hands behind his back and calmly walked towards his seat. However, after taking a few steps, he almost bumped into a woman. With Li Daocheng's divine sense, he naturally wouldn't have collided with her. If it weren't for the fact that this woman's aura was very familiar and distracted Li Daocheng, the two of them wouldn't have even brushed shoulders. However, because this woman was too special, even Li Daocheng was momentarily distracted. This woman was none other than Xiao Shima, the woman who wanted to fake a marriage with Li Daocheng when he first woke up. Li Daocheng hadn't seen Xiao Shima since they parted ways at Xuanfang Courtyard on Kangwu Planet. He didn't expect to meet her here today. Li Daocheng naturally didn't have any romantic feelings towards Xiao Shima. Back then, they were just using each other. However, after some things happened later, Li Daocheng's impression of Xiao Shima had changed greatly. He didn't hate this woman. More or less, Li Daocheng had some other feelings for Xiao Shima. It wasn't love, but a kind of affection. After all, the two of them had gotten married before. Even if it was fake, they still held a banquet and announced it to the world. They even lived together for a period of time. Li Daocheng had only gotten married once in his 2 lives, so it was hard not to have a deep impression of her. Therefore, Xiao Shima inevitably became a very special existence in Li Daocheng's heart. Li Daocheng, Xiao Shima almost bumped into a man. She felt apologetic and wanted to apologize to the other party. However, when she raised her head and saw the man wearing sunglasses, she immediately recognized Li Daocheng. Xiao Shima had heard rumors that Li Daocheng was dead. Therefore, when she saw Li Daocheng, her pretty face was full of surprise and disbelief. Li Daocheng was a little embarrassed to be recognized at a glance. Xiao Shima's cultivation wasn't high, so she could recognize him with just her eyesight. His disguise was really simple. Until now, no one had recognized him, but that was only because there weren't many people who knew him. Li Daocheng wanted to pretend that he didn't know Xiao Shima and walk away. Unexpectedly, his arm was suddenly grabbed. Li Daocheng, is it really you? Xiao Shima's voice trembled with excitement. Li Daocheng pursed his lips and looked at his ex-wife in name. His heart was filled with mixed feelings. The past flashed through his mind, and then he nodded and said, "Eldest Miss Xiao, long time no see." Hearing Li Daocheng's address of her, Xiao Shima's heart inexplicably skipped a beat. She felt an indescribable pain. Regret was the source of this pain. After going through so much, Xiao Shima realized that she had missed out on such a powerful backer. Back then, because she had looked down on others, and because of her stupidity and ignorance, she had completely drawn a line between herself and Li Daocheng. Being blind to this extent was also a skill. Xiao Shima had mocked herself countless times over the years. Back then, she had done everything she could to save the collapsing Qiao family. But she didn't know that the person who could save her was right by her side. But she hadn't found out and had looked down on others. In the end, not only had she failed to save the family, she and her sister had almost lost their lives. If she had just a little bit of eyesight, she would have been able to pull the Qiao family back from the brink of collapse. She only needed to be a little bit nicer to Li Daochong, a little bit more magnanimous, and not so high and mighty. Li Daochong, they said you, Xiao Shima wanted to say something, but stopped. What did they say about me? That I'm dead. Li Daochong indifferently continued. Yes. Xiao Shima nodded. Sister, you're here. The people from Fang Hong's brain are looking for you. Li Daochong was just about to say something when a familiar voice came from behind Xiao Shima. It was Xiao Shima's sister, Xiao Shima. Li Daochong looked around, and the corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up slightly. It's a small world. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.